Major Elena Vance was holding a sheared gray-date bolt between her thumb and forefinger at 04:15 a.m., watching the way the floodlights of the Fort Cavazos motor pool caught the jagged edge of a fracture that shouldn't have been there on a vehicle with only 1,200 miles on the odometer. The steel was too bright, too crystalline, lacking the dull, fibrous strength of the American-made alloy specified in the striker's technical manual. To anyone else in the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, it was just a broken part, a nuisance on a Tuesday morning in the dry, dusty heat of central Texas. To Elena, it was a fingerprint. She rubbed her thumb over the metal, the scent of pressurized hydraulic fluid and burnt diesel clinging to her skin like a second identity, and she felt the familiar, cold tightening in her chest that came whenever she found a lie hidden in the hardware. She was technically Captain Vance this morning, a mid-level logistics officer with a reputation for being overly cautious and physically unremarkable. But the way she analyzed that fracture, noting the molecular grain of the counterfeit steel, belonged to a woman who had spent a decade inside the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. The motor pool was a cathedral of echoing metal and the rhythmic clank of impact wrenches. It was the kind of place where the air always tasted like grit and JP-8 fuel, a taste Elena had known since she was 6 years old, sitting on a red stool in her father's garage in Youngstown, Ohio. Her father had been a master mechanic for the city's fleet of snowplows, a man who believed that you could tell the character of a person by how they treated their tools. He had taught her that machines don't lie, only the people who maintain them do. She had brought that Youngstown steel with her into the military, a quiet, stubborn insistence on the truth of things. It was what made her the best forensic auditor in the CID, though currently, the 300 soldiers of the maintenance company saw her only as a paper pusher who had been reassigned from the 101st Airborne after a supposed administrative error ruined her promotion track. That was the cover, anyway. The truth was that Elena Vance didn't make administrative errors, she found them. She dropped the bolt into the pocket of her OCP trousers, the weight of it a grounding presence. Around her, the morning maint push was in full swing. Sergeants were barking orders, and young specialists were hauling heavy crates of spare parts. Nobody looked at her. To them, she was a ghost in the machine, a woman who spent too much time looking at manifests and not enough time leading from the front. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was a tool, just like the bolt in her pocket. It allowed her to see the small things. The way a certain shipment of brake pads arrived in boxes with slightly blurred ink on the logos. The way a specific warrant officer always seemed to be on duty when the high-value electronics were offloaded. And the way the unit's readiness ratings were climbing, despite the fact that the equipment was screaming for mercy. Elena walked toward the back of the hangar, her boots making a rhythmic, steady sound on the oil-stained concrete. She didn't march. She moved with a controlled, predatory economy of motion that she had spent years disguising as a clumsy, administrative shuffle. She stopped near a stack of shipping crates marked for the 1st Squadron's upcoming deployment to the National Training Center in California. A young corporal named Miller was checking off items on a ruggedized tablet. He looked up, his face slick with sweat despite the early hour. He was 22, from a small town in Georgia, and he was one of the few people who didn't look through her. He saw the way she looked at the equipment, even if he didn't understand what he was seeing. "Captain," Miller said, nodding respectfully. "You're out early. Again." "The morning air is better for thinking, Miller," Elena replied, her voice low and steady. It was a voice that didn't demand attention, but commanded it if you were listening closely enough. "How are those new steering assemblies looking?" Miller wiped his forehead with the back of a greasy hand. "They're okay, ma'am. A little stiff. The chief says they just need to be broken in. We're pushing to get the whole squadron green by the end of the week." Colonel Sterling isn't taking no for an answer on the readiness report. Elena didn't react to the name, but she felt the atmospheric pressure in the room seem to drop. Colonel Marcus Sterling was a rising star in the armor branch, a man whose uniform looked like it had been carved out of granite and whose ambition was a palpable force. He was the reason she was here. For 18 months, Sterling's units had boasted the highest operational readiness rates in the entire Army. On paper, he was a miracle worker. In the real world, according to a whispered tip from a retired master sergeant, he was a man who had figured out how to bypass the legitimate supply chain to keep his numbers perfect, regardless of the cost to the soldiers who would eventually have to drive those machines into a fight. "The chief is a smart man," Elena said, her eyes tracking a forklift as it moved a pallet of engine oil. "But break-in periods shouldn't feel like the metal is fighting itself. Just keep an eye on the heat signatures after the test drives. If they run hot, you tell me, not the chief." "Me." Miller hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen of his tablet. He looked around to see if anyone was listening. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the colonel said we aren't to delay the loadout for minor mechanical variances." His words. He's already on edge about the delay in the 3rd Platoon strikers. "I'm aware of what the colonel said, Corporal," Elena said softly. She stepped a fraction of an inch closer, and for a second the mask of the failure captain slipped. Her eyes, a sharp, piercing gray, locked onto his. But when a steering assembly fails at 60 miles an hour on a California highway, minor mechanical variance is just a fancy way of saying catastrophic casualty. "Watch the heat. That's an order." Miller swallowed and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Elena turned and walked away, her mind already back on the sheared bolt. She needed to get to the regional procurement office files, but those were locked behind a level of encryption that she couldn't access from a motor pool terminal without triggering an alert. She needed a physical bridge, a way to link the counterfeit parts on the floor to the digital trail of money and signatures in the regimental headquarters. As she stepped out of the hangar into the pre-dawn Texas gloom, the heat was already beginning to rise from the tarmac. The sky was a bruised purple, the stars fading. She headed toward the regimental headquarters, a 2-story brick building that sat like a fortress at the end of the main parade ground. This was Sterling's domain. She had a small, windowless office in the basement, tucked between the records room and a janitor's closet. It was the perfect place for a woman everyone wanted to forget. She was halfway across the parking lot when a black SUV pulled into the command spot. The door opened, and Colonel Marcus Sterling stepped out. He was exactly what the recruiting posters promised: tall, square-jawed, with a chest full of ribbons that spoke of tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He carried a leather briefcase and an aura of supreme confidence that bordered on the divine. He spotted her immediately. Elena didn't try to avoid him. She stopped, stood at attention, and rendered a crisp, textbook-perfect salute. Sterling returned it with a casual, dismissive flick of his hand. He didn't stop walking. "Captain Vance, I saw your memo on the hydraulic fluid discrepancies. Do you ever sleep, or do you just spend 24 hours a day looking for reasons to slow down my regiment?" Elena fell into step 2 paces behind him, as was proper. "I sleep, sir, but the fluid levels in the 2nd Squadron's reserves were 4% below the minimum viscosity requirement. It's a safety issue." Sterling stopped abruptly at the glass doors of the headquarters and turned to face her. He was a head taller than her, and he used every inch of it to look down. His eyes were hard, the color of cold tea. "Safety. Right. You know, Vance, I've read your file. You were a high performer once. Then you hit a wall. You started seeing ghosts in the paperwork. You started thinking your job was to be a gatekeeper instead of an enabler. And now here you are, in my motor pool, trying to find fault with a unit that is currently the most combat-ready force in the United States Army." "I'm not looking for fault, Colonel," Elena said, her voice flat, devoid of any defensive tremor. "I'm looking for the truth." Sterling let out a short, dry laugh. "The truth is that we are going to NTC, we are going to crush the OPFR, and I am going to get my star. And you are going to stay in that basement and stay out of the way of the men who actually do the work. You are a failure as an officer, Vance. You lack the one thing a leader needs, the ability to see the big picture. You're so obsessed with a single bolt that you'd let the whole machine rust in the rain." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I didn't ask for you to be assigned here, but since you are, understand this. If you disrupt my deployment schedule one more time with these observations, I will have you processed out of this man's army so fast your head will spin. Am I clear?" Elena looked him directly in the eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She felt a surge of that controlled rage, a white-hot spark buried deep under layers of professional ice. She thought about the sheared bolt in her pocket. She thought about the fact that if she were who he thought she would be trembling. But she wasn't. She was simply measuring the distance between his ego and the cliff he was about to walk over. "Crystal clear, Colonel," she said. Sterling sneered, turned, and marched into the building. Elena stayed where she was for a moment, breathing in the scent of his expensive cologne and the faint smell of the Texas dust. She waited until the door clicked shut before she let her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. She wasn't hurt by his words, she was energized by them. A man that defensive was a man who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. He wasn't just cutting corners, he was protecting a kingdom. She headed down to her basement office, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead with a low-frequency hum that most people found maddening, but she found soothing. It was a constant. She sat at her desk, which was piled high with busy work Sterling's staff had given her, mostly old equipment logs that needed to be digitized. She turned on her computer and waited for the slow, government tissue boot sequence. While she waited, she took the bolt out of her pocket and set it on a clean white sheet of paper. She pulled a small jeweler's loop from her top drawer, a gift from her father, and leaned into the light. Under magnification, the truth was even uglier. There was a tiny stamp on the base of the bolt head, a stylized S that was supposed to represent a high-end foundry in Pennsylvania. But the S was slightly off-center, and the curve of the letter was too sharp. It was a counterfeit mark, one she'd seen 3 years ago in a procurement fraud case in South Korea. The big picture Sterling spoke of was a mosaic, and Elena Vance was the only one looking at the individual tiles. Her computer dinged. She didn't go to the logistics portal. Instead, she opened a secondary, encrypted partition on her hard drive that required a physical hardware key. A small, nondescript USB drive she kept on a chain around her neck, hidden under her undershirt. This was her link to CID headquarters at Quantico. She typed in a 32-character password and watched as the screen transformed. The generic Army desktop vanished, replaced by a clean, minimalist interface. A message was waiting for her. Asterisk source confirms. Shipment Vanguard 7 diverted through a private warehouse in Houston before arriving at Cavazos. Manifests were altered in transit. Sterling's signature appears on the diversion authorization. You need the physical manifest from the Houston warehouse. Without it, he has plausible deniability. Asterisk Elena leaned back in her chair, the plastic creaking. Houston was 3 hours away. Sterling was moving his regiment to the railhead in 48 hours. The window was closing. She looked at the bolt on her desk. That bolt had come from a striker that was slated to be part of a live-fire exercise. If the transmission casing failed under the torque of a combat maneuver, the vehicle would seize, and the men inside would be sitting ducks. Or worse, the vehicle would flip. She checked the time. 05:45. The sun would be up soon. She had to stay in the office until at least 17:00 to maintain her cover as the lazy logistics officer who was just counting down the days until her discharge. But she couldn't wait until 17:00. She heard footsteps in the hall, heavy, rhythmic. She quickly pulled the USB key, the screen reverting to the boring logistics spreadsheet just as her door opened. It was Master Sergeant Holloway, the regimental maintenance supervisor. He was a man who looked like he'd been chewed up by the army and spit out, only to go back for seconds. He had a thick neck, a graying buzz cut, and eyes that had seen too many wars and too many bad officers. He was Sterling's right hand in the motor pool, the man who made the colonel's readiness miracles happen. "Captain," Holloway said, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't look like he liked being in the basement. "The colonel wants a status update on the 1st Squadron's loadout. He said you were concerned about some parts." Elena put on her best, overwhelmed face. She let her eyes wander to the piles of paper on her desk. "Oh, Master Sergeant, yes, I was looking at the steering assemblies. They just felt different. I'm sure it's nothing. I was just telling Corporal Miller to keep an eye on them." Holloway walked into the room, his presence filling the small space. He picked up the bolt from the white paper before Elena could stop him. He turned it over in his calloused fingers. "This from the striker in Bay 4, the one that sheared during the test?" "Yes." Elena said, her voice slightly higher, performing the role of the nervous junior officer. I just thought it was strange for a new part to fail like that. Holloway looked at her, his eyes narrowing. There was a moment of silence where Elena felt the air grow thin. Holloway wasn't an idiot. He had been a mechanic for 25 years. He knew what a gray-date bolt was supposed to look like. He knew the smell of counterfeit steel. Bolts break, Captain, Holloway said, his voice a low rumble. That's why we buy them in bulk. Don't go looking for conspiracies in a bucket of hardware. It makes people think you're not a team player. I just want the soldiers to be safe, Master Sergeant, she said, projecting a soft, naive earnestness. Holloway tossed the bolt back onto the desk. It landed with a dull thud. The soldiers are safe because we give them the best equipment in the world. And we get that equipment because Colonel Sterling knows how to cut through the red tape that people like you love to wrap everything in. Stay in your lane, Vance. It's a lot safer there. He turned and walked out, but he didn't close the door. Elena watched his shadow disappear down the hallway. He hadn't threatened her, not exactly, but the message was clear. The entire command structure of the regiment was locked into Sterling's success. They weren't just following orders, they were invested in the lie. She waited 5 minutes, then stood up and grabbed her cap. She couldn't stay in the office. She needed to see the warehouse in Houston, and she needed to do it now. She walked out of the office, but instead of heading for the main stairs, she took the service exit that led to the loading docks. She found her car, a 10-year-old silver Honda Civic that screamed "unsuccessful officer," and drove toward the main gate. As she passed the parade ground, she saw the 1st Cavalry Division's Horse Cavalry Detachment out for a morning ride. The sight of the horses, the riders in their historic uniforms, the brass of the bugles gleaming in the rising sun, usually felt like a reminder of the tradition and honor of the service. Today, it felt like a funeral procession. She felt the weight of the bolt in her pocket, the physical evidence of the rot hidden beneath the polished surface of the regiment. She thought about Sterling's words, "You are a failure as an officer." She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She wasn't a failure. She was the only one doing her job. The cost of her failure was her reputation, her career, and the respect of her peers. She had accepted that the day she took the undercover assignment, but the cost of Sterling's success was going to be paid in blood. The drive to Houston was a blur of flat Texas landscape and shimmering heat waves. Elena didn't turn on the radio. She worked through the logistics in her head. The warehouse was owned by a company called Apex Tactical Solutions. On paper, they were a legitimate subcontractor for the Army's secondary supply chain. In reality, they were a shell company, a black hole where genuine parts were swapped for cheap, high-quality fakes, with the difference in price being funneled into a network of offshore accounts. Sterling was the one who authorized the emergency diversions to Apex, claiming the official depots were too slow to meet his readiness goals. She arrived in Houston by mid-morning. The warehouse was located in a sprawling industrial park near the ship channel, a place where the air smelled of salt water, chemicals, and rotting fish. It was a massive, windowless concrete box surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. There were no signs, just a street number. Elena parked 2 blocks away and walked back, her ops making her stand out in the civilian environment. She didn't care. She was Captain Vance on official business. She walked up to the gate and waited for the security guard to come out of the shack. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the guard asked, looking at her rank and her name tape. He was an older man, retired law enforcement by the look of his posture. "Captain Vance, 3rd Cavalry Regiment," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "I'm here to conduct a spot audit on the Vanguard 7 shipment. There was a discrepancy in the receiving logs at Fort Cavazos." The guard frowned. "I don't have an audit on the schedule. It's an unannounced spot check per the contract's oversight clause," Elena said, stepping closer to the fence. She held up a clipboard with a generic-looking audit form she'd printed before leaving. "Unless you'd like me to call the Defense Contract Management Agency and tell them I was denied access." The guard hesitated, then shrugged and buzzed the gate open. "Suit yourself. Boss is in the main office. Ask for Mr. Thorne." Elena walked across the gravel lot, her heart hammering a steady, rhythmic beat against her ribs. This was the dangerous part. Thorne wouldn't be as easy to fool as a gate guard. She entered the office, which was cooled to a frigid 60 degrees. A man in a sharp, expensive suit was sitting behind a glass desk, talking on a cell phone. He looked up, his eyes scanning her with the predatory intelligence of a shark. He hung up the phone without saying goodbye. "A captain," Thorne said, his voice smooth and oily. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Colonel Sterling didn't mention he was sending anyone today." Elena didn't miss the name. "The colonel is busy with the railhead operations. I'm the one who has to fix his paperwork. There's a missing manifest for a shipment of Stryker transmission components that passed through here last Tuesday. I need the original physical copy for the regimental audit trail." Thorne leaned back, his fingers interlaced. "Everything we do is digital, Captain. The manifests are uploaded to the portal." "The portal version has a digital signature mismatch," Elena said, leaning on the desk, her face inches from his. She let her controlled rage simmer just beneath the surface. "And if I don't have a clean paper trail by the time the IG arrives on Friday, I'm the one who gets a reprimand. I don't like reprimands, Mr. Thorne. I'm already on thin ice. So, are you going to help me, or am I going to have to make this an official investigation?" Thorne stared at her for a long, agonizing minute. Elena didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just held his gaze, her gray eyes cold and unyielding. She saw the moment he decided she was just a desperate, low-level officer trying to save her own skin. "Fine," Thorne said, standing up. "Follow me. We keep the hard copies in the back for 6 months before shredding." He led her through a heavy steel door into the warehouse. The space was enormous, filled with towering racks of crates. It was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of a refrigeration unit. Thorne walked to a row of filing cabinets in a small, fenced-in cage. He unlocked it and began flipping through folders. Elena stood back, her eyes scanning the warehouse. Her capability wasn't just about spotting bad bolts, it was about spatial memory. She saw the layout, the camera angles, the exits. She also saw a stack of crates in the corner that didn't have the standard military shipping labels. They were marked with a logo she recognized, a stylized S inside a circle. "Here," Thorne said, pulling out a folder. "Vanguard 7, original manifest, signed by the receiving officer and the warehouse manager." He handed it to her. Elena opened the folder. Her eyes went straight to the signature line at the bottom. It wasn't Sterling's signature. It was Master Sergeant Halloway's. But next to it, in the authorized by box, was a stamp. Not a signature. A personal command stamp belonging to the regimental commander. But that wasn't what stopped her heart. In the itemized list of parts, there was a handwritten note in the margin. Asterisk substituted per verbal order ref, Iron Horse Protocol. Asterisk Elena knew every protocol in the 3rd Cav. There was no Iron Horse Protocol. "Is there a problem, Captain?" Thorne asked, his voice losing its smoothness. "No," Elena said, closing the folder. "Just what I needed. Thank you for your cooperation." "Wait," Thorne said, stepping in front of her as she turned to leave. "I need to log that you took the original, standard procedure." "Of course," Elena said. She followed him back to the office, her mind racing. She had the link. Halloway was the muscle, Sterling was the authority, and Iron Horse Protocol was the code for the fraud. But she needed to know what the protocol actually entailed. Was it just parts, or was it something bigger? As Thorne was writing in a logbook, his desk phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and his expression changed. He looked at Elena, then back at the phone. "Excuse me," he said, picking up the handset. Yes, she's right here." Elena didn't wait to hear the rest. She knew that call was from the base. Someone had noticed she was gone. Someone had put the pieces together. She turned and walked out of the office, not running, but moving with the fast, purposeful stride of a woman who knew the exits. She heard Thorne shout behind her. She hit the gravel lot and ran for her car. She was 2 miles away, weaving through the heavy Houston traffic, when her personal cell phone buzzed in her pocket. It was an unrecognized number. She answered it. "Major Vance," a voice said. It wasn't the voice of her handler at Quantico. It was a voice she recognized from the motor pool. It was Chief Warrant Officer Miller. "Miller," she said, her grip tightening on the wheel. "How did you get this number?" "I saw your real ID in the colonel's trash yesterday, ma'am," Miller whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't tell anyone, I swear, but you need to know." They're loading the 3rd platoon strikers onto the rail cars right now. And Holloway? He's not just swapping parts anymore. He's disabling the remote fire suppression systems on all the lead vehicles. He said it was Iron Horse protocol. He said it was for a special exercise. Elena felt a cold wave of horror wash over her. Disabling fire suppression wasn't about saving money. It was about ensuring a catastrophe. "Miller, listen to me," Elena said, her voice like iron. "Get away from the railhead. Don't talk to anyone. I'm on my way back." "You can't come back, ma'am," Miller said, his voice breaking. "Colonel Sterling just issued an all-points bulletin for you. He's telling everyone you're AWOL and that you stole classified documents. He said you're mentally unstable and a threat to the mission. If you show up at the gate, they'll arrest you." "Let them try," Elena said. She hung up the phone and pushed the little Honda Civic to 80 miles an hour, heading north toward Cavazos. The deep breath of the investigation was over. The storm had arrived. As she drove, she thought about the failure Sterling had called her. He thought she was a woman who couldn't see the big picture. He was wrong. The big picture wasn't about readiness ratings or career milestones. It was about the 300 soldiers who were currently being loaded onto a train with vehicles that were designed to fail. She reached the outskirts of Colleen as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the Texas plains. She didn't go to the main gate. She knew a service entrance used by the contractors, a gate that was often left open during the chaos of a major deployment. She ditched her car in a strip mall parking lot and moved on foot, her ops blending into the twilight. She moved through the woods on the edge of the base, her body remembering the scout training she'd done years ago. She was no longer a logistics officer. She was a major in the United States Army on a mission of internal defense. She reached the railhead under the cover of darkness. The area was a hive of activity, illuminated by massive portable floodlights. Hundreds of soldiers were moving in the glare, their shadows dancing against the steel of the strikers. The air was thick with the sound of metal on metal and the low growl of engines. Elena found a vantage point behind a stack of shipping containers. She pulled a pair of compact binoculars from her pocket and scanned the line of vehicles. She saw Sterling. He was standing on a raised platform, overlooking the operation like a king surveying his kingdom. Beside him stood Master Sergeant Holloway. They were talking, their heads close together. Then she saw the lead striker, the one Miller had mentioned. Holloway stepped down from the platform and walked over to it. He opened the side hatch and climbed inside. A minute later, he emerged, holding a small electronic component. He tossed it into a nearby trash bin and signaled to the driver. He wasn't just cutting corners. He was sabotaging his own unit. Elena felt a surge of tension, so thick it felt like a physical weight. She had the manifest in her pocket. She had the testimony of Miller. But she was a failure and a fugitive. If she stepped out now, she'd be tackled and silenced before she could say a word. She looked at the command platform. Sterling was smiling, shaking hands with a visiting general who had arrived to witness the Iron Horse deployment. The general was nodding, impressed by the speed and efficiency of the operation. Elena realized then that the Iron Horse protocol wasn't just a fraud. It was a demonstration. Sterling was going to show the world how a perfectly maintained unit could overcome a sudden mechanical crisis in the field, further cementing his reputation as a tactical genius. He was going to risk the lives of his soldiers for a choreographed victory. She reached into her pocket and felt the sheared bolt. She thought about her father's garage, the smell of grease, and the simple, unyielding truth of a well-made machine. She wasn't going to let him do it. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized but never used. It was the direct line to the commanding general of the 1st Cavalry Division. "This is Major Elena Vance, CID," she said when the aide answered. "I have a level 1 emergency. Put the general on the line. Now." "Major, we have a report that you're AWOL and—" "I am currently standing 500 yards from a sabotage in progress," Elena interrupted, her voice a whip crack in the night. "Colonel Sterling is disabling fire suppression systems on the 1st Squadron's lead vehicles. If those trains move, people die. You have 30 seconds to decide if you want to be the one who explains to the Secretary of the Army why you didn't listen to the officer who has the proof." There was a silence on the other end, the kind of silence that happens right before a dam breaks. "Hold for the general," the aide said. Elena watched the platform. Sterling was looking at his watch. He raised a hand, ready to give the signal for the first train to depart. "This is General Thompson," a deep, gravelly voice said. "Major Vance, you better be right about this. I'm holding the sheared bolt of a counterfeit transmission in my left hand, General," Elena said, her eyes locked on Sterling. "And the fraudulent manifest in my right. If you look at the lead striker's internal diagnostic port, you'll find the suppression bypass. Send the MPs, now." She hung up. She didn't wait for the MPs. She stepped out from behind the shipping containers and began to walk toward the platform. She moved through the sea of soldiers, a ghost in the light. She didn't hide anymore. She walked with the weight of her true rank, her shoulders back, her eyes fixed on the man who had called her a failure. She was 50 yards away when Holloway saw her. He froze, his hand going to the holster at his hip. He leaned over and whispered to Sterling. Sterling turned. His face went from a smile to a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped to the edge of the platform and pointed a finger at her. "There she is," he roared, his voice carrying over the din of the railhead. "That's the officer. Arrest her. She's compromised. Get her off my flight line." 2 MPs near the platform began to move toward her. Elena didn't stop. She didn't run. She kept walking, a solitary figure in the center of the glare. "Colonel Sterling," she shouted, her voice cutting through his command. "By the authority of the United States Army Criminal Investigation Division, I am ordering you to stand down. This railhead is now a crime scene." The MPs stopped. The soldiers stopped. The silence that fell over the railhead was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Sterling's face went pale, then a dark, bruised purple. He laughed, a high, strained sound. "Sid, you're a failure, Vance. You're a clerk who couldn't handle the pressure. Someone get her out of here." He looked at the MPs, but they didn't move. They were looking at the way Elena was standing. They were looking at the cold, dark competence in her eyes. "The Iron Horse Protocol is over, Marcus," Elena said, her voice quiet but carrying to every ear in the silence. She reached the base of the platform. She looked up at him, the man who thought he had won. "You said I couldn't see the big picture," she said. "But the big picture is made of small things, like a sheared bolt, like a signature on a fake manifest, like the fact that you thought you could break the army to build a career." In the distance, the first sirens began to wail. Blue and red lights flickered against the dark Texas sky, hundreds of them screaming toward the railhead. Sterling looked at the horizon, then back at Elena. For the first time, the confidence in his eyes flickered. He looked at Holloway, who was already stepping back, trying to vanish into the shadows. "You're nothing," Sterling hissed, leaning over the rail. "You're a ghost." "I'm the ghost that's been watching you for 18 months, Elena said. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the sheared bolt, and tossed it. It landed at Sterling's feet, a small, jagged piece of the truth he couldn't hide anymore. The first MP vehicles screeched to a halt at the edge of the platform. Doors flew open. Elena Vance stood her ground, the wind from the arriving helicopters whipping her hair, the weight of her mission finally, devastatingly clear. She was no longer the failure. She was the officer who had held the line when the line was rotting from the inside out. And as the first handcuffs clicked in the silence, she knew that the cost was only beginning to be paid. The metal of the handcuffs biting into Colonel Sterling's wrists made a sharp, mechanical sound that seemed to echo across the entire railhead, louder in Elena's ears than the idling diesel engines of the strikers. It was a sound of finality, yet as Elena watched the military police lead the man away, his back still rigid, his head still held with that arrogant, aristocratic tilt, she felt none of the satisfaction that should have accompanied a closed case. The air around her was thick with the smell of scorched ozone and the damp, metallic scent of the coming rain. The soldiers of the 3rd Cavalry stood like statues in the harsh glare of the floodlights, their faces caught in a collective expression of shock and betrayal. They were looking at Sterling, then at Elena, and then at the ground. They had been ready to follow that man into the dirt of a California training range, and within the span of 10 minutes, the world they understood had been dismantled by a woman they had spent months ignoring. General Thompson stepped into the circle of light, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was a man who looked like he had been weathered by 30 years of West Texas wind, his face a map of hard lines and deep-seated exhaustion. He didn't look at Sterling. He looked at Elena. He looked at the sheared bolt she had tossed onto the platform, and then he looked at the CID badge she was now holding openly in her palm. The badge was a small piece of gold and silver, but in this light it looked like a sun. "Major Vance," Thompson said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the wind. "My office, 20 minutes, and bring that manifest." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned on his heel and walked toward his command vehicle, his staff officers trailing behind him like a wake of nervous sharks. Elena didn't move immediately. She watched Holloway being escorted to a separate vehicle, the master sergeant's face a mask of cold, professional indifference. He didn't look back. He was a man who knew how to survive, and Elena knew that men like Holloway didn't break in an interrogation room. They waited for the system to find a reason to let them go. She felt a presence at her shoulder. It was Corporal Miller. He was pale, his eyes wide, his hands shaking slightly as he clutched his tablet. He looked like he wanted to say something, to offer some kind of validation or perhaps an apology, but the words wouldn't come. Elena turned to him, her expression softening just a fraction, the only leak in the reservoir of her control. "Go back to your barracks, Miller," she said softly. "Don't talk to anyone. If someone from the colonel's staff approaches you, you tell them you're waiting for a CID liaison. Do you understand?" "Ma'am," Miller whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't know it was this big. I just thought it was the parts." "It's always bigger than the parts, Miller," Elena said. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a brief, grounding weight. "You did your job, now let me do mine." She watched him walk away into the darkness before she turned toward the command building. The walk felt longer than it was. Every soldier she passed seemed to pull back, as if she were carrying a contagion. To them, she wasn't the hero who had saved them from a mechanical catastrophe. She was the internal predator, the one who had been hiding in their midst, watching their failures, recording their secrets. It was the specific loneliness of the investigator, a price she had paid a dozen times before in places like Seoul and Ramstein, but it never got easier. It was the cost of being the one who sees the truth when everyone else is invested in the lie. The general's office was a shrine to the history of the 1st Cavalry Division, swords, unit guidons, and framed photographs of men in Stetson hats. Thompson was sitting behind his desk, the manifest Elena had recovered from Houston spread out before him. A JAG lawyer, a colonel with a face like a hawk, was standing by the window, his arms crossed over his chest. "Sit, Major," Thompson said, not looking up. Elena sat. She didn't lean back. She sat with her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing deep and rhythmic. She was the most controlled person in the room, and she knew that bothered the JAG officer. "The Iron Horse Protocol," Thompson said, finally looking up. He tapped the handwritten note in the margin of the manifest. "I've been the CG of this division for 2 years. I've never heard of it. My chief of staff has never heard of it. And yet, here it is, documented in a civilian warehouse, authorizing the removal of life-saving equipment from my vehicles. Explain it to me." "It's not an army protocol, General," Elena said, her voice flat and precise. "It's a corporate one. My team at Quantico has been tracking a series of procurement anomalies across 3 different Canuse installations over the last 18 months. Fort Bragg, Fort Carson, and now Cavazos. In each case, a high-performing commander was seeing unprecedented readiness ratings despite budget cuts and supply chain delays. We couldn't find the link until I saw that S stamp on the bolt." "The S for Sterling?" the JAG officer asked, his voice skeptical. "No," Elena replied, turning her head slightly to look at him. "The S for Sovereign Foundry. It's a shell company based out of a defunct steel mill in Pennsylvania. They specialize in high-fidelity counterfeits of Grade 8 and Grade 10 hardware. They don't just make bolts, Colonel. They make transmission gears, brake rotors, and turbine blades for Abrams engines. They produce them for pennies on the dollar using substandard alloy, and they sell them to contractors like Apex Tactical in Houston." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Thompson's. Colonel Sterling wasn't just trying to save money, he was being recruited. The Iron Horse Protocol was a trial run. Sovereign Foundry provides the parts that keep the unit green on the readiness report, and in exchange, Sterling ensures that those parts are the only ones used in his regiment. He gets the promotion, the Foundry gets the government contract, and the soldiers get vehicles that are essentially ticking time bombs. Thompson rubbed his face with both hands, the weariness in his eyes deepening into something closer to grief. And the sabotage tonight? The fire suppression? That was the demonstration phase, Elena said. Sterling needed a crisis he could miraculously solve. If a striker catches fire during a high-profile exercise at NTC and the fire suppression fails, but his crews manage to save the vehicle using superior training and initiative, he looks like a god. He proves that his regiment can overcome any failure. It's the ultimate ego play. He was willing to risk a crew being burned alive to ensure his next star. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioner and the distant, muffled sound of the sirens outside. Elena felt the tension in the room shift. It was no longer about a corrupt colonel. It was about the institutional failure that had allowed a man like Sterling to climb so high while a woman like Elena was buried in a basement. "This manifest," the JAG officer said, stepping away from the window. "It's signed by Master Sergeant Halloway. Sterling's name isn't on the substitution order. He has a command stamp, but anyone could have used that. You're asking us to court-martial a war hero on the word of a major who's been undercover for 6 months and a handwritten note in a civilian folder. The defense will tear this apart." "I'm not asking you to do anything, Colonel," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "I'm telling you what happened. The evidence is in the vehicles. Every striker in the 1st Squadron is currently outfitted with counterfeit drivetrain components. If you let those trains move, and one of those bolts shears at highway speed, the blood won't just be on Sterling's hands. It'll be on yours." Thompson looked at the JAG officer, then back at Elena. "The trains are stayed. Nothing moves until every vehicle is inspected by an independent team from TACOM. But Major, there's a problem." Elena felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The problem. There was always a problem when the truth got too close to the people who made the decisions. "The Sovereign Foundry investigation is being pulled from CID, Thompson said, his voice quiet. "Department of the Army Oversight has taken over the file. They're classifying the Iron Horse Protocol as a matter of national security. They want your notes, your hardware key, and your physical evidence. And they want you to return to Quantico for a mandatory debriefing and reassignment." "Reassignment?" Elena asked. She didn't let the anger show, but it was there, a white-hot needle in her heart. "General, I've spent 18 months on this. I'm 3 days away from identifying the primary financier of Sovereign Foundry. If I leave now, they'll scrub the Houston warehouse and disappear." "It's not my call, Vance," Thompson said, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely regretful. "The orders came from the Pentagon. They're saying your cover is blown and you're a liability. They're framing this as a clerical error in the supply chain to avoid a public scandal. They want Sterling to retire quietly for health reasons rather than face a public trial." Elena stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. She felt the weight of the institution pressing down on her, the same institution she had sworn to protect, the same one that was now trying to swallow the truth to save its own image. She thought about her father's garage in Youngstown. She thought about the way he used to say that a crack in the foundation would eventually bring down the whole house, no matter how many times you painted the walls. "He tried to kill his soldiers, General," she said, her voice a whisper that felt like a scream. "He sabotaged his own equipment for a promotion. If you let him walk, you're telling every soldier in this division that their lives are worth less than a colonel's reputation." "I know what I'm doing, Major," Thompson said, his face hardening. "Now, hand over the manifest and report to the MP station for transport. That's an order." Elena looked at the manifest on the desk. She looked at the JAG officer, who was already reaching for it. She felt a moment of profound clarity. The system wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as it was designed to. It was protecting itself. And as long as she stayed within the system, she was part of the problem. She didn't hand over the manifest. Instead, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her encrypted USB drive, the one with the link to Quantico, and set it on the desk. "Everything you need is on that drive, General," she said. She turned and walked out of the office before he could say another word. She didn't go to the MP station. She walked down the hallway, past the portraits of the heroes, and out into the cooling Texas night. The rain had finally started, a light, misty drizzle that felt like ash on her skin. She didn't have a plan yet, but she had something better. She had the original manifest tucked into the waistband of her trousers, hidden under her blouse. She had given Thompson the copy, and she had something else. A small, handwritten slip of paper Miller had given her months ago, a list of the personal cell phone numbers for the lead mechanics at Sovereign Foundry. Miller hadn't known what they were at the time, he just thought they were expedited tech support. She reached her car, the silver Civic sitting in the shadows of the parking lot. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment, the rain drumming a rhythmic, frantic beat on the roof. She was officially AWOL now, or worse. She was a major with classified evidence who had just disobeyed a direct order from a general officer. She pulled out her personal phone and dialed a number. "It's me," she said when the voice answered. It was a woman's voice, sharp and weary. Sarah Jenkins, a former CID agent who had been retired 3 years ago after an investigation into a defense contractor went south. Sarah was the only person Elena trusted. "Elena, I saw the news. A colonel at Cavazos got hauled off in cuffs. I figured you were in the middle of that mess." "The mess is just getting started, Sarah," Elena said, watching the headlights of an MP patrol car cruise slowly through the parking lot. She ducked her head, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The army is burying it. They're pulling me out and letting Sterling walk. They're calling it a supply chain error." "Of course they are," Sarah sighed. "The big green machine doesn't like to admit it has cancer. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to Pennsylvania," Elena said. "I have the manifest and the direct line to the foundry. I'm going to find the source before the Pentagon's oversight team can burn the evidence." "You're going rogue, Elena," Sarah said, and there was a note of fear in her voice. "If you do this, there's no coming back. You'll be a felon. You'll lose everything." "I already lost everything the day I realized my uniform didn't mean what I thought it did," Elena said. "I'm not doing this for the army. I'm doing it for the kids who have to drive those strikers." "Okay," Sarah said after a long pause. "If you're going to Pennsylvania, you need a place to stay that isn't on the grid. My cousin has a hunting cabin outside of Scranton. I'll text you the coordinates. And Elena, watch your back. If Sovereign Foundry is big enough to get the Pentagon to move this fast, they've got people everywhere." "I know," Elena said. She hung up and started the car. She drove out of the gate, not looking back at the floodlights or the railhead or the life she was leaving behind. She felt a strange sense of lightness, the kind that only comes when you finally stop trying to hold up a collapsing roof and just walk out the door. The drive north was a blur of highway lights and caffeine. She avoided the major interstates, sticking to the back roads that wound through the heart of the country. She saw the American landscape shifting from the flat, dusty plains of Texas to the rolling green hills of Arkansas and Tennessee. She stopped only for gas and cheap coffee, paying in cash, her eyes always on the rearview mirror. She reached Pennsylvania 48 hours later. The state was a maze of old industrial towns, places where the ghosts of the steel industry still haunted the river valleys. The air was colder here, smelling of damp earth and coal dust. She found the cabin Sarah had mentioned, a small, weathered structure tucked deep into a forest of hemlock and pine. It was perfect. It was invisible. She spent the first night cleaning her weapon, a Sig Sauer M17 she had forgotten to turn in, and spread the manifest out on the small wooden table. She studied the names, the dates, the Iron Horse Protocol note. She realized then that the protocol wasn't just a code, it was a schedule. There were 4 other shipments listed, all destined for different units. One was heading to a forward operating base in Poland. Another was going to a special operations unit in Okinawa. This wasn't just a scam. It was a systemic compromise of the U.S. military's global readiness. She pulled out the list of phone numbers Miller had given her. She chose the first one and dialed it from a burner phone. It rang 4 times before a man answered. "Yeah," the voice said. It was rough, accented with the hard vowels of the Rust Belt. "I'm calling about the Vanguard 7 shipment," Elena said, her voice steady, projecting a calm she didn't feel. "There was a problem with the gray date bolts. Colonel Sterling is unavailable. I'm the new point of contact." There was a long silence on the other end. Elena could hear the sound of a television in the background, a sporting event, the roar of a crowd. "Who is this?" the man asked, his voice dropping into a defensive growl. "My name isn't important," Elena said. "What's important is that the MPs are crawling all over Fort Cavazos, and the manifest with your signature on it is currently in my possession. If I give it to the general, you're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison. If you talk to me, maybe we can work something out." "I don't know what you're talking about," the man said, but the tremor in his voice told a different story. "We're a legitimate foundry. We make industrial hardware." "You make coffins, Mr. Gantry," Elena said, using the name she'd found on the manifest. "I've seen the steel. I've seen the fractures. I'm at the hunting cabin on Miller Road. You have 2 hours to get here and tell me who's paying you. If you don't show, I'm calling the FBI." She hung up. It was a gamble, a massive, dangerous gamble. She was baiting a trap with herself as the lure. She spent the next 2 hours prepping the cabin. She moved the furniture, checked the sight lines from the windows, and positioned herself in the shadows of the back room, her Sig Sauer on the table in front of her. The sun went down, the forest turning into a wall of black. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin's settling timbers. Then she heard it, the low rumble of an engine. A pair of headlights cut through the trees, sweeping across the front of the cabin. A dark SUV pulled into the clearing and stopped. Elena watched from the window. A man stepped out. He was thick-set, wearing a heavy work jacket and a baseball cap. He looked around nervously, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was alone. "Mr. Gantry?" Elena called out, her voice amplified by the silence. "Hands where I can see them. Walk toward the door." The man complied, his movements jerky and terrified. He stepped into the cabin, blinking in the dim light of the single lantern Elena had left burning. He saw her then, a shadow in the corner, her eyes 2 chips of gray ice. "You the one who called?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Sit," Elena said, gesturing to the chair. He sat. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life working with his hands, his skin etched with the grime of the foundry. He didn't look like a criminal mastermind, he looked like a man who was drowning. "Tell me about Sovereign Foundry," Elena said. "Tell me who started it." Gantry swallowed hard. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. We were just supposed to provide alternative parts, to help with the shortages. They told us it was all approved. They said the army needed a way to bypass the red tape." "Who is they?" "A man named Vance," Gantry said. Elena felt the world tilt. The name hit her like a physical blow, a cold, sickening shock that radiated from her chest to her fingertips. Vance, it was her name, her father's name. "What Vance?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know his first name," Gantry said, looking at her with genuine confusion. "He just called himself the specialist. He showed up 3 years ago with the blueprints and the contracts. He had the S stamp. He said he was retired military. Said he knew the system was broken and he was the only one who could fix it." Elena felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her father had died 10 years ago in a car accident, or had he? She thought about the administrative error that had ruined her career, the way she had been handpicked for the Cavazos assignment, the way the Iron Horse protocol seemed so perfectly designed to play on her specific skills. Was she being hunted, or was she being led? "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice hardening. "I don't know," Gantry said. "He only comes to the foundry once a month to check the quality. He's obsessed with the steel. He says the purity of the alloy is the purity of the mission." The phrasing was familiar, too familiar. It was the kind of thing her father used to say in the garage in Youngstown. Asterisk, the character of the tool is the character of the man. Asterisk, he's coming tomorrow, Gantry whispered, to oversee the shipment for Poland. If you're going to do something, you have to do it then. Elena looked at the man, her mind racing. She saw the fear in his eyes, the desperation. She also saw the truth. This man was a pawn, just like Sterling, just like Miller. They were all pieces in a game she didn't fully understand yet. "Go home, Gantry," Elena said, standing up. "If you tell anyone I was here, I'll find you. Do you understand?" The man nodded frantically and scrambled out of the cabin. Elena watched his taillights disappear into the trees. She stood in the center of the room, the lantern flickering, the silence of the forest pressing in on her. She was alone in the dark, a fugitive from the army she loved, hunting a ghost who might share her own blood. She felt a surge of fear, real and visceral, the kind that lives in the marrow of the bone. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a cold, dark competence that had been forged in the fires of 100 investigations. She picked up her weapon and checked the magazine. She thought about the sheared bolt, the fingerprint of a lie. She thought about the soldiers in Poland, waiting for parts that would fail them when they needed them most. She didn't know who the specialist was, but she knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, the Iron Horse Protocol was going to meet its match. She blew out the lantern, the cabin plunging into total darkness. She sat by the window, her eyes adjusting to the shadows, her hand steady on the grip of her gun. She waited for the dawn, her mind already moving through the tactical possibilities, the angles of fire, the lines of retreat. She was Major Elena Vance, and she was no longer looking for a fault in the machine. She was the fault, and she was about to break the whole thing wide open. By 03:00 a.m., the drizzle had turned into a steady, freezing rain that rattled against the cabin's tin roof like 1,000 silver needles. Elena didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness, her mind a cinematic reel of every moment that had led her here. The smell of the motor pool, the arrogant tilt of Sterling's chin, the way Miller's hands had shaken. She realized then that her extraordinary capability, the one the army had tried to bury under a mountain of paperwork, wasn't just about seeing the molecular flaws in steel. It was about seeing the molecular flaws in people. She had seen the crack in Sterling, the hollow ambition that made him vulnerable. She had seen the quiet integrity in Miller. And now, she was seeing the shadow of someone who knew her better than she knew herself. She moved with the silent, practiced efficiency of a predator. She packed her gear, the manifest, the Sig Sauer, the burner phone, and a small, specialized kit of forensic tools she had acquired before leaving Cavazos. She didn't leave a trace of her presence in the cabin. She was a ghost again, but this time she wasn't hiding from the enemy. She was hunting him. The Sovereign Foundry was located on the outskirts of a dying town called Bethlehem, tucked into a bend of the Lehigh River. It was a massive, skeletal structure of rust-colored brick and corrugated steel, surrounded by a high fence that had seen better days. Smoke curled from a single chimney, a gray smudge against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky. This was the heart of the rot. Elena parked her Civic in a flooded lot half a mile away and moved through the woods, her ox providing perfect concealment in the tangled undergrowth. She reached the perimeter fence and found a section where the chain link had been pulled away from the post. She slipped through, her boots making no sound on the wet gravel. The foundry was a cathedral of industry, filled with the low-frequency hum of electric furnaces and the rhythmic clanging of heavy machinery. The air was thick with the smell of scorched earth and hot metal, a scent that felt like home and a threat all at once. She moved through the shadows of the outer yard, passing stacks of raw scrap metal, old engine blocks, twisted rebar, the discarded bones of 100 different machines. This was the raw material for the lies. She found a loading dock on the north side of the building. A single truck, a nondescript white semi with no markings, was backed into the bay. Men were moving in the dim light of the interior, loading crates marked with the S logo. They moved with a hurried, nervous energy. They knew the window was closing. Elena climbed a rusted fire escape to a catwalk that ran along the ceiling of the main floor. From here, she could see everything. The furnaces glowed like angry eyes, casting long, flickering shadows across the floor. In the center of the room, a man was standing at a heavy oak table, his back to her. He was wearing a dark, well-tailored overcoat that looked out of place in the grime of the foundry. He was looking at a set of blueprints, his hands resting on the table with a familiar, proprietary stillness. Elena felt a jolt of electricity run down her spine. The way the man stood, the slight tilt of his head, the way his shoulders were set was a perfect mirror of her own posture. She adjusted the zoom on her binoculars. The man turned slightly to speak to a worker. His face was older, his hair a shock of silver, but the eyes were hers, piercing, intelligent, and cold as the river outside. It wasn't her father. It was her uncle, Thomas Vance, the man who had supposedly died in a helicopter crash in Afghanistan 12 years ago. The man whose name was etched onto a black granite wall at Arlington. Elena felt a wave of nausea wash over her, followed immediately by a surge of white-hot rage. Thomas Vance had been a legend in the Ordnance Corps, a master of logistics, and a man who believed that the military's supply chain was the most powerful weapon in the world. He hadn't died, he had simply gone underground, taking his knowledge and his connections with him to build a shadow empire on the bones of the institution he had once served. She saw him reach into his coat and pull out a small, stylized stamp. He pressed it onto a document on the table, the same S she had seen on the bolt. He wasn't just the financier, he was the architect. "The shipment for Poland is ready, sir," one of the workers said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Good," Thomas said, his voice a deep, cultured rasp. "Make sure the manifests are double-keyed. We can't afford any more administrative errors like the one at Cavazos." Sterling was a fool. He let his ego get ahead of the protocol. "What about the woman, sir? The one Gantry mentioned?" Thomas paused, his hand hovering over the blueprints. He let out a short, dry laugh. "Elena, she's exactly where I wanted her to be. She's the only one with the skill to find the trail and the only one the Army would never believe. By the time she realizes who I am, she'll be a fugitive with no place left to run. She's not an obstacle, Marcus. She's the final piece of the demonstration. If a CID major can't stop the protocol from the inside, then the protocol is invincible." Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She wasn't the hunter. She was the proof of concept. The entire 18-month investigation had been a stress test for the Iron Horse Protocol, a way for Thomas to see if his counterfeits could withstand the scrutiny of the best forensic mind in the service. And she had passed his test. She had found the bolts, but she hadn't been able to stop the machine. She felt the weight of the Sig Sauer in her hand. She could end it now. One shot from the catwalk and the architect would be gone. But the sovereign foundry was just one node. If she killed him here, the shipments to Poland, Okinawa, and Germany would still move. The rot would just find a new head. She needed the master drive. She needed the digital keys that authorized the bypasses in the global logistics network. She looked at the table. Next to the blueprints was a ruggedized laptop, its screen glowing with a complex map of shipping routes. That was the prize. She began to move along the catwalk, her eyes fixed on the laptop. She reached the section directly above the table and waited for the workers to move toward the loading dock. Thomas was alone for a moment, his back still turned as he studied the map. Elena didn't use the stairs. She swung over the railing and dropped 10 feet, landing on a stack of crates with a dull thud. She rolled and came up in a crouch, her weapon leveled at her uncle's back. "Don't move, Thomas," she said, her voice a cold, sharp blade in the silence. The man froze. He didn't turn around. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "I wondered how long it would take you to find the catwalk," he said, his voice devoid of surprise. "You always did like the high ground, Elena, just like your father." "My father believed in the truth," Elena said, stepping closer, her eyes locked on the back of his head. "He didn't build his career on the lives of soldiers." Thomas turned slowly, his hands held out to his sides in a gesture of mock surrender. He looked at her, his gray eyes reflecting the orange glow of the furnaces. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who had seen the end of the world and decided to profit from it. "The truth is a luxury we can't afford anymore, Elena," he said softly. "The Army is a dinosaur. It's slow, bloated, and trapped in a supply chain that's been broken since the Cold War. I'm not destroying it. I'm evolving it. Sovereign Foundry provides what the system can't: speed, efficiency, and adaptability. By selling them garbage," Elena spat. "By making bolts that shear under pressure." "The bolts only shear if you know where to look," Thomas said, taking a step toward her. Elena tightened her grip on the SIG, the front sight post steady on his chest. "Most of them will hold, long enough for the mission to succeed, long enough for the commanders to get their promotions. It's a calculated risk, Elena. Every war is a calculated risk." "You're a traitor," she said. "I'm a realist," he countered. "And right now, the reality is that you are a woman with a gun in a room full of men who are paid very well to make sure you never leave this building. You have the manifest, you have your pride, but I have the network. Join me, Elena. Use that mind of yours for something more than just finding faults. Help me build the new machine." "I'd rather watch it burn," she said. She lunged for the laptop, her hand reaching for the drive. But Thomas was faster than he looked. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong and twisted. Elena felt a flash of pain, but she didn't cry out. She used the momentum to drive her knee into his ribs and followed up with a sharp elbow to his jaw. He stumbled back, his face a mask of sudden, genuine shock. He hadn't expected her to fight like a soldier. He had expected her to argue like an investigator. Elena grabbed the laptop and ripped the hardware key from the side port. She turned to run, but the doors to the loading dock swung open. 4 men, armed with submachine guns, stepped into the light. "Kill her," Thomas rasped, clutching his side. "And get that key back." Elena didn't hesitate. She dove behind a stack of steel plates as the first burst of gunfire chewed through the crates where she had been standing. The sound was deafening, the muzzle flashes illuminating the swirling dust and smoke of the foundry. She was trapped. The loading dock was blocked, the fire escape was too far, and the main doors were likely crawling with more of Thomas's security. She looked around, her mind working at 1,000 miles an hour, analyzing the space. She saw the electric furnace, its lid slightly ajar, the molten steel inside a roiling sea of white-hot liquid. She saw the heavy-duty crane cables hanging from the ceiling, and she saw the main power junction box on the far wall. She fired 2 shots to keep the gunmen's heads down, then scrambled toward the junction box. She reached into her kit and pulled out a small, high-intensity thermite charge, a tool she'd kept for emergency evidence disposal. She slapped it onto the main transformer and pulled the pin. "Cover your eyes," she yelled, though there was no one to hear her. The flash was blinding, a white-hot explosion of sparks and molten copper. The entire foundry plunged into darkness as the main breakers blew, the only light now coming from the dying glow of the furnaces. The gunfire stopped. The men were shouting, their voices filled with confusion and fear. They didn't have night vision. Elena did. She pulled her PVS-14 goggles from her pack and snapped them onto her helmet. The world turned into a ghostly, high-contrast green. She saw the gunmen moving blindly, their weapons waving aimlessly in the dark. She saw Thomas, his face contorted with rage, shouting orders that no one was following. She moved like a shadow through the green-tinted world. She took down the first gunman with a single, precise shot to the shoulder, then vanished behind a row of cooling racks before the others could react. She wasn't trying to kill them, she was trying to create a path. She reached the back of the foundry, where the raw scrap was fed into the furnaces. There was a small maintenance hatch that led to the riverbank. It was her only way out. She was 10 feet from the hatch when a hand grabbed her from behind, pulling her back. She spun, her knife out, and found herself staring into the face of Thomas Vance. He had found a pair of goggles of his own. He didn't use a gun. He used a heavy steel pipe, swinging it with a desperate, clumsy strength. Elena blocked the blow with her forearm, the bones screaming in protest, and drove the butt of her pistol into his temple. He went down, but he didn't stay down. He lunged for her legs, his fingers clawing at the laptop case. "You can't, stop it," he wheezed, blood trickling down his face. "The Poland shipment, it's already at the port." Elena kicked him away, her face a mask of cold, professional detachment. She looked down at him, the man who had shared her name and her blood, and felt nothing but a profound sense of distance. "Watch me," she said. She turned and dove through the maintenance hatch, sliding down a muddy embankment into the freezing waters of the Lehigh River. The current was strong, pulling at her gear, but she held onto the laptop with a death grip. She swam with the current, her body numbing in the cold, until the lights of the foundry were nothing but a dim, orange glow in the distance. She dragged herself onto the opposite bank, gasping for air, her lungs burning. She was cold, she was bleeding, and she was alone in the dark. But she had the key. She opened the laptop, the screen flickering to life in the rain. She accessed the main directory, bypassing the encryption with the physical key. She saw the manifest for the Poland shipment, Vanguard 12. It was currently sitting on a dock in Baltimore, scheduled to be loaded onto a transport ship in 4 hours. If that ship sailed, the Iron Horse Protocol would be active in a combat zone. She looked at her burner phone. She had one call left. She didn't dial Thompson. She didn't dial Sarah. She dialed the only person she knew who was still inside the system and still had the soul of a soldier. "Miller," she said when the corporal answered on the second ring. "Ma'am, where are you? The MPs are everywhere, they're saying." "Listen to me, Miller," Elena interrupted, her voice steady and commanding despite the chattering of her teeth. "I need you to get to the regimental signal shack. I need you to bypass the command lock and send an emergency flash message to the Port of Baltimore Authority. Tell them shipment Vanguard 12 contains hazardous counterfeit materials and is a threat to national security. Use my authorization code, Sierra Papa 09er. "Ma'am, I could go to jail for that," Miller whispered. "You could," Elena said. "But if you don't, 300 soldiers in Poland are going to be driving vehicles that will kill them before the enemy does. The choice is yours, Corporal." There was a long silence. Elena watched the rain falling on the river, the dark water rushing past like the secrets of the foundry. "I'm moving now, ma'am," Miller said. Elena closed the laptop and leaned her head against a cold, wet stone. She was exhausted, her body a map of pain and fatigue. She knew that by tomorrow, she would be the subject of a nationwide manhunt. She knew that the oversight team at the Pentagon would do everything in their power to erase her. But as she sat there in the dark, she felt a small, flickering light of hope. The Iron Horse Protocol wasn't invincible. It was made of people, and people could be broken. She looked at the foundry across the river. A fleet of black SUVs was pulling into the yard, their headlights cutting through the rain. They were coming for her. She stood up, her legs shaking but her back straight. She adjusted the strap of her bag and began to walk into the woods, heading toward the coordinates Sarah had given her. She wasn't running. She was repositioning. The battle for the 3rd Cavalry was over. The battle for the soul of the army was just beginning, and Elena Vance was the only one who knew where the next bolt would shear. She stopped at the edge of the trees and looked back one last time. The foundry was a silhouette against the rising gray light of a new day. She thought about the big picture Sterling had spoken of and the realism Thomas had claimed. They were wrong. The big picture wasn't a map or a career or a protocol. It was the truth of the machine and the woman who refused to let it lie. She turned and vanished into the trees, the rain washing away her tracks, the key to the empire clutched tight against her heart. She didn't know what would happen in Baltimore or what the Pentagon would do when they found the empty office in Pennsylvania. She only knew that she was still breathing, still watching, and still right. And for now, that was enough to keep the engine running. The transition from major to fugitive happened in the space between 2 heartbeats as Elena Vance stepped over the rusted threshold of the Sovereign Foundry's perimeter fence. The chain link groaned, a low, metallic protest that was swallowed by the roar of the Lehigh River and the rhythmic, industrial thrum of the factory floor. She was no longer operating under the color of law. There was no badge in her pocket, no radio linked to a command center, no quick reaction force waiting to pull her out if the situation went south. She was a woman in a damp field in Pennsylvania, carrying a stolen laptop and a weapon she hadn't turned in, hunting a ghost that wore her own family's face. The weight of the Sig Sauer against her hip felt different now, not a tool of her trade, but the only thing keeping her from becoming a footnote in a classified report. The foundry was a cathedral of rot and fire. It smelled of sulfur, burnt ozone, and the peculiar, cloying scent of wet coal. As Elena moved through the skeletal shadows of the outer yard, she felt the extraordinary capability she usually kept suppressed begin to flare. It wasn't a psychic power. It was a hyperacute awareness of structural integrity. She didn't just see a building. She saw the load-bearing beams that were 10% past their fatigue life. She didn't just see a truck. She saw the microscopic stress fractures in the wheel bolts that would, given 60 more miles, shear off under the weight of the cargo. She saw the world as a collection of things waiting to break, and right now, the most fragile thing in the valley was the lie she had lived her entire career. She reached the loading dock, her breath hitching in her chest as she watched the men move. They weren't soldiers, but they moved with a disciplined, mercenary efficiency. They were loading crates marked with the S stamp, each one containing a dozen pieces of hardware destined to fail. Elena's hands were steady, but her heart was a hammer against her ribs. She was acting without authorization, without a net, and the cost was already mounting. Back at Cavazos, she was likely already listed as a deserter/AWOL. Her career was a scorched field. Her reputation was a casualty. But the mission, the real mission, was the only thing that remained standing. She climbed the fire escape, the iron rungs slick with freezing rain. Every movement was a calculation of sound and shadow. She reached the high catwalk, looking down into the belly of the beast. The heat from the electric arc furnace rose in shimmering waves, distorted and hellish. And there, at the center of the chaos, stood Thomas Vance. Seeing him was like looking into a distorted mirror. He was her father's younger brother, the war hero who had supposedly vanished into the Afghan dirt a decade ago. He was the man who had taught her how to read a topographic map before she could read a novel. He stood over a table of blueprints with the same analytical stillness that Elena used when she was dissecting a crime scene. The betrayal wasn't just institutional, it was genetic. Check the heat on the second ladle. Thomas's voice carried up to her, a raspy, authoritative baritone that sent a chill through her despite the heat of the furnace. We're running 3 points low on the carbon content. If the hardness isn't within spec, the inspectors at the port might actually do their jobs for once. Sir, the Baltimore shipment is already on the move, a man replied. The Polish manifest is cleared through the digital bypass you set up. We're green across the board. Thomas nodded, a slow, satisfied movement. The beauty of the system, Marcus, is that it wants to be lied to. It's too big to see its own shadow. My niece spent 18 months hunting a bolt, and she never realized she was just helping me calibrate the sensor. Elena's grip tightened on the railing. The demonstration. She had been a tool for him, a way to test the resilience of his corruption. He had let her find the clues so he could see where his armor was thin. It was a violation deeper than any physical wound. She felt a surge of controlled rage, a cold, sharp needle that threaded through her nerves, anchoring her. She didn't scream, she didn't act on impulse. She waited for the workers to move toward the loading bay, her eyes never leaving the back of her uncle's head. The moment the floor cleared, Elena dropped. It was a 10-foot fall, muffled by the roar of the machinery. She landed in a crouch on a stack of industrial pallets, the impact vibrating through her teeth. She didn't wait for him to turn. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of a woman who had spent half her life in the dark, her Sig Sauer leveled at the center of his spine before he could even register the change in the air. "Don't move, Thomas," she said. The words were short, hard stops. Thomas Vance didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his hands. He just stood there, looking down at the blueprints for a moment longer before slowly, agonizingly, turning to face her. He looked older than the photos, his skin etched with the grime of the foundry, but his eyes were the same piercing gray as hers. "Elena," he said, and there was a note of genuine pride in his voice that made her skin crawl. "I told them you'd find the catwalk. You always were better at the vertical approach than your father. He was too grounded, too tied to the earth." "My father is dead," Elena said, her voice a flat, dangerous monotone. "And you're a ghost. I'm here to make it permanent." Thomas smiled, a thin, mirthless expression. "Is that what they told you in the CID briefings? That I'm a villain? I'm the only one in this family who's actually solving the problem, Elena. The army is a dying engine. It's out of fuel, out of ideas, and its parts are failing because the world has moved past it. I'm just providing the bypass. I'm the grease that keeps the wheels turning when the bureaucracy freezes. You're selling counterfeit steel to soldiers who are going into combat." Elena spat, the words tasting like copper in her mouth. "You're killing them for a percentage." "I'm choosing who survives," Thomas countered, taking a step toward her. Elena's finger tightened on the trigger, the take-up on the M17 nearly gone. The Iron Horse protocol ensures that the units with the most initiative get the parts they need. The weak ones? They fail. It's Darwinism in a Stetson hat. And you, Elena, you're the most capable person I've ever seen. That 18-month chase you led me on, it was magnificent. You found flaws in my supply chain that my best engineers missed. You're not a cop, you're a builder. Join me. We can fix the whole machine from the inside. I'm not a builder, Elena said, her eyes narrowing. I'm the person who finds the crack in the foundation, and I just found yours. She lunged for the ruggedized laptop on the table, her hand grabbing the hardware key that she knew held the digital authorizations for the global shipments. But Thomas wasn't a sedentary bureaucrat. He was a man who had survived a decade in the shadows. He caught her wrist, his grip like a steel vise, and for a second they were locked in a stalemate of shared blood and divergent paths. You can't stop it, he hissed, his face inches from hers. The Poland shipment is already at the dock. The Okinawa crates are on the air. It's over, Elena. You're a fugitive, you have nothing. I have the truth, she said. She drove her knee into his midsection, a sharp, professional strike that broke his grip. She followed up with a palm strike to his chin that sent him reeling back into the table. She grabbed the laptop, but the doors to the loading dock burst open. 4 men in tactical gear, carrying suppressed submachine guns, flooded the room. They didn't shout. They didn't ask for a surrender. They opened fire. The sound of the suppressed rounds was like the tearing of silk, punctuated by the asterisk clack-clack asterisk of the bolts. Elena dove behind a heavy steel workbench as the first volley chewed through the oak table where she had been standing seconds before. Splinters of wood and glass from the laptop screen sprayed across her face, one small shard slicing into her cheek. She didn't feel the pain. She felt the narrow, cold focus of a person operating at the absolute edge of her capability. She was pinned. The workbench was solid, but the gunmen were spreading out, moving to flank her. She looked at the laptop in her hand. The screen was cracked, but the hardware key was intact. She looked at the furnace 10 yards away, the molten steel glowing with an intensity that hurt the eyes. She needed a diversion. She needed the dark. She reached into the small kit at her belt and pulled out the thermite charge. It was meant for evidence disposal, a small, high-heat canister that could melt through a safe in seconds. She didn't throw it at the gunmen. She threw it at the main power transformer on the far wall, the one that hummed with the energy of the entire foundry. The explosion was a silent, blinding flash of white light. It wasn't a concussive blast, but a thermal one. The transformer erupted in a shower of molten copper and blue sparks, the high-voltage lines snapping like whip cracks. The entire building groaned as the power died, the overhead lights flickering and then plunging the foundry into a pitch-black abyss. The only light now was the dull, orange ember of the cooling furnace. Elena didn't wait for her eyes to adjust. She reached for her PVS-14 goggles, snapping them onto her helmet mount. The world snapped into a grainy, high-contrast green. She saw the gunmen instantly. They were stumbling, their hands over their eyes, blinded by the flash. One of them was screaming, his hand caught in a shower of sparks from the dying transformer. She moved. She didn't run, she flowed. She moved through the green-tinted shadows, her boots making no sound on the grit-covered floor. She took the first gunman from behind, a sharp strike to the temple with the butt of her pistol that sent him to the ground in a silent heap. She didn't kill him. She didn't have time for the weight of another soul. She took his radio and moved on. The second and third gunmen were back-to-back near the loading bay, firing blind into the darkness. Elena didn't engage them head-on. She climbed a stack of steel billets, her muscles screaming with the effort, and dropped onto the third man from above. The impact was jarring, a sharp pain radiating through her shoulder as she hit the concrete, but she used the momentum to sweep the second man's legs out from under him. She was a ghost in their midst, a shadow that hit with the force of a freight train and vanished before they could find their feet. Thomas, she heard a voice scream in the dark. She's got night vision, we can't see her. Kill everything that moves. Thomas's voice came from the far side of the room, near the office. He sounded desperate now, the calm of the architect replaced by the frantic energy of a man whose house was burning down. Elena reached the back of the foundry, the cold air from the riverbank calling to her through a small maintenance hatch. But as she reached for the handle, a heavy weight slammed into her back. It was Thomas. He hadn't run. He had found a pair of goggles of his own, the green glow of the tubes reflecting in his eyes like a demon's stare. He didn't have a gun, he had a heavy iron pry bar, and he swung it with a savage, clumsy strength that caught Elena across her left forearm. The bone didn't snap, but the pain was a white-hot explosion that nearly blinded her. She dropped the laptop, the ruggedized case skidding across the floor toward the edge of the furnace pit. "It's mine, Elena," Thomas roared, lunging for the laptop. "Everything I built. I won't let a child take it from me." Elena didn't think. She didn't feel the pain in her arm. She only saw the mission. She tackled him before his hand could touch the case, the two of them rolling across the gritty floor toward the edge of the pit. The heat from the molten steel was unbearable now, a physical weight that pressed against her skin, singeing the fine hairs on her arms. They fought with the desperation of two people who knew that only one would leave this room. It wasn't a cinematic fight. It was a brutal, ugly struggle for survival. Thomas bit, clawed, and struck with a frantic, animalistic energy. Elena used her training, her movements precise even in the chaos. She caught him with a sharp elbow to the throat, then a palm strike to his nose that sent a spray of dark blood across his face. He fell back, his heels skidding on the edge of the pit. For a second, he teetered there, the orange glow of the steel illuminating him like a figure in a Renaissance painting of hell. He looked at her, and for the first time the pride was gone. There was only fear. "Elena!" He gasped, reaching out a hand. She didn't take it. She didn't push him either. She just stood there, her chest heaving, her left arm hanging uselessly at her side. She watched him find his balance, his fingers clawing at the air until he managed to throw himself forward, away from the heat. He lay on the floor, gasping, his spirit broken even if his body wasn't. Elena picked up the laptop. She didn't look back at him. She didn't offer a word of comfort or a final condemnation. She had the data. She had the truth. And the cost was her family, her name, and every bridge she had ever built. She dove through the maintenance hatch, the freezing rain hitting her face like a benediction. She slid down the muddy embankment, her boots sinking into the silt of the Lehigh River. The water was ice cold, a shocking contrast to the heat of the foundry. She waded in, the current pulling at her, fighting to keep the laptop above the surface. She swam. It wasn't a graceful stroke. It was a desperate, one-armed crawl against the pull of the river. Her left arm was a dead weight, the pain a rhythmic throb that kept time with her heartbeat. The water filled her boots, her clothes, her lungs. She felt the darkness of the river trying to swallow her, the silence of the woods a heavy shroud. She reached the opposite bank 100 yards downstream, dragging herself out of the water like a drowned rat. She lay in the mud for a long time, the rain washing the blood and grit from her face. She was shaking, a deep, bone-deep tremor that she couldn't control. She was alone, she was wounded. She was a criminal in the eyes of the country she loved, but she had the key. She sat up, her back against a moss-covered rock, and opened the laptop. The screen was a spiderweb of cracks, but it flickered to life. The hardware key glowed with a steady, blue light. She accessed the main manifest for the Poland shipment, Vanguard 12. It was sitting on Pier 4 at the port of Baltimore. The ship, the Cape Rise was scheduled to cast off in 3 hours. If she didn't stop it, the Iron Horse Protocol would be active in a combat theater. The consequences would be measured in lives, not reports. She pulled her burner phone from her waterproof pouch. It had 1 bar of service. She didn't call the Pentagon. She didn't call the FBI. They would only see the AWOL major, the thief of classified data. They would spend 4 hours arguing about jurisdiction while the ship sailed. She dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "Miller," she said when the voice answered. Her voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Ma'am, Major Vance, where are you? The post is on lockdown. CID is here, they're searching your quarters, they're saying you took." "Listen to me, Miller," Elena interrupted. She closed her eyes, forcing the words out through the fog of pain. "I don't have much time. I need you to do something that will probably get you court-martialed. I need you to be the soldier I know you are." "Anything, ma'am," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming steady. "Go to the regimental signal shack. Use the override code I gave you for the diagnostic logs. Once you're in, I want you to send an emergency flash message to the Port of Baltimore Authority and the Coast Guard Sector Commander. Tell them that shipment Vanguard 12 on the Cape Rise contains hazardous counterfeit components that pose an immediate threat to the ship's structural integrity. Use my personal authorization, Sierra Papa 09er. "Ma'am, that's a high-level override. They'll track it back to me in minutes." "I know," Elena said. She looked at her bruised, swollen arm, the skin turning a sickly shade of purple in the moonlight. And they'll track it back to me. But if that ship sails, Miller, it's not just about the parts. It's about the fact that we let it happen. We saw the crack and we didn't fix it. Don't let them sail, Miller, please. There was a long silence on the other end. Elena could hear the distant sound of a siren in the background of Miller's end, the MPs moving through the barracks at Cavazos. "I'm at the shack now, ma'am," Miller said softly. "The message is being drafted. I'll send it on your mark." "Send it," Elena said. "And Miller, thank you." "Good luck, Major," he said. The line went dead. Elena closed the phone and leaned her head back against the rock. She felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. She had done the only thing she could. She had thrown herself into the gears of the machine to stop it from grinding up any more lives. The cost was everything she was, but as she watched the first gray light of dawn begin to bleed into the Pennsylvania sky, she realized that she had never felt more like a soldier. She wasn't a major anymore. She wasn't an investigator. She was just a woman in the woods, holding a broken laptop and a heavy truth. The immediate aftermath was a blur of cold and silence. She didn't move for an hour, watching the foundry across the river. She saw the headlights of the black SUVs arriving, the men in tactical gear swarming the building. She saw the flashlights moving through the woods on the other side, hunting for her. They wouldn't find her yet. She knew these woods. She knew how to disappear. She stood up, her body screaming in protest. Every joint felt like it was filled with ground glass. She wrapped her arm in a strip of cloth torn from her undershirt, tying it tight with her teeth. She picked up the laptop and the cig, her movements slow and deliberate. She began to walk. She didn't head for the road. She headed deeper into the forest, toward the hunting cabins Sarah had mentioned. She needed to heal. She needed to plan. The Iron Horse Protocol was wounded, but it wasn't dead. Thomas Vance was still out there. The people who had authorized him were still in their offices at the Pentagon, drinking their coffee and looking at their readiness reports. They would come for her. They would call her a traitor. They would try to bury the truth under a mountain of paperwork and national security redactions. But Elena Vance was still breathing. She was still watching, and she knew exactly where the next crack would form. She reached the edge of a ridge and looked down at the valley. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of the city of Bethlehem, the lights of the houses where people were waking up, unaware that the world they lived in was built on a foundation of failing steel. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, the specific loneliness of the person who sees the ghost in the room while everyone else is admiring the wallpaper. She touched the shard of glass in her cheek, pulling it out with a steady hand. The blood was warm against her cold skin. It was real. The pain was real. The mission was real. She turned away from the valley and vanished into the trees, a ghost returning to the shadows. She didn't know if she would ever wear a uniform again. She didn't know if she would ever see Miller or Sarah or the sun over the Texas plains. But as the first rays of light hit the hemlock trees, she felt the cold, dark competence within her settle into something permanent. The machine was broken, and she was the only one who knew how to forge it anew. The walk to the cabin took 4 hours. By the time she reached the small, weathered structure, the sun was high in a clouded sky. The rain had stopped, replaced by a biting wind that smelled of pine and damp earth. Elena entered the cabin, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of intrusion. It was empty. It was safe. She sat on the floor, her back against the door, and let the laptop slide from her fingers. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat in the silence, listening to the sound of her own breathing. She was the most controlled person in the world, even now, especially now. She looked at her hands. They were covered in mud, grease, and her uncle's blood. She began to clean them, one finger at a time, with a rag she found near the stove. It was a slow, methodical process, a way to reclaim herself from the chaos of the night. She was Major Elena Vance. She had been publicly humiliated, quietly sidelined, and ultimately betrayed. She had lost her career, her family, and her safety, but she had kept her soul. And in the world she lived in, that was the most extraordinary capability of all. She closed her eyes and let the sleep finally take her, a deep, dreamless exhaustion that felt like a temporary death. She knew that when she woke up, the hunt would begin in earnest. She knew that the reckoning was coming, but for now, the ship was stayed. The bolts were being inspected, and the truth, for one brief, shining moment, was the only thing that mattered. She slept with her hand on the grip of her gun, a soldier even in the dark, waiting for the next dawn. The Iron Horse Protocol had met its match in the woman they had tried to use, and as the shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, the silence was the only thing left of the empire Thomas Vance had tried to build. Elena was still standing. Barely, but standing, and in the world of failing steel, that was everything. The smell of wood smoke and old, damp cedar was the first thing Elena Vance registered when the fever finally broke on the second night in the cabin. It was a sharp, Appalachian scent that cut through the metallic tang of the blood drying on her undershirt and the chemical odor of the antiseptic she'd found in a rusted first aid kit under the sink. Her left arm was no longer just a source of pain. It had become a heavy, throbbing appendage that felt like it belonged to someone else, a swollen mass of purple and black heat that radiated up into her neck. She lay on the floorboards, her cheek pressed against the rough grain, watching a single silver dust mote dance in a sliver of moonlight. She was a major in the United States Army, a graduate of West Point, a woman who had spent 15 years building a reputation for surgical precision and unshakable loyalty. And now she was a ghost hiding in a shack 12 miles from a crime scene she had created. The gap between who she was and what the world thought of her had become a canyon, and as she shifted her weight, the agony in her radius reminded her that the bridge was gone forever. 300 miles away, in a windowless room at the Pentagon known as the Tank, the institutional machine was already beginning to erase her. General Marcus Thorne sat at the head of a mahogany table that had seen the planning of 3 wars, his eyes fixed on a digital manifest that shouldn't have existed. Beside him, 2 colonels from the Judge Advocate General's Corps and a civilian liaison from the Department of Justice sat in a silence so thick it felt pressurized. On the screen, the data Elena had extracted from the Sovereign Foundry was scrolling in a relentless waterfall of evidence. Part numbers, shipping weights, metallurgical deviations, and the names of shell companies that bled into the accounts of half a dozen logistics contractors. It was the Iron Horse Protocol, in its rawest form, a blueprint for systemic failure that would have, within 24 months, grounded 40% of the Army's rotary wing fleet. The Coast Guard boarded the Cape Rise at 0300. The civilian liaison said, his voice a flat, nasal drone that lacked any trace of the weight of the moment. They found the Vanguard 12 crates in the secondary hold. The forensic team from Aberdeen is already on site. They've run a preliminary scan on the main rotor hub assemblies for the Polish delivery. The carbon content is 7% below the safety threshold. The hardness test failed on every single unit. If those birds had gone into the air in a high-temperature environment, they would have disintegrated mid-flight. General Thorne didn't look up. He was a man built of hard angles and a lifetime of suppressed emotions, but the way his hand gripped the edge of the table made the knuckles turn a porcelain white. He had signed the authorization for those parts. He had trusted the readiness reports that told him the supply chain was robust. He had been the one to sign the order for Major Elena Vance's administrative leave, citing burnout and erratic behavior after she had first brought the discrepancies to his office. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who believed in the institution more than he believed in the individuals who served it, and that belief was now a noose. "And Vance?" Thorne asked. His voice was a low growl, the sound of a man trying to maintain structural integrity while the foundation crumbled. "She's in the wind, sir," the lead JAG colonel replied. "We have a bolo out through the state police in Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland. The FBI has flagged her passport. The official narrative we're feeding to the press is that a CID officer suffered a mental break and is currently being sought for the theft of classified hardware. We're framing it as a security breach, not a whistleblower event. If the truth about the steel gets out before we can contain the legal liability, we're looking at a congressional inquiry that will shut down the entire procurement office for a decade." "She saved those pilots," Thorne said, finally looking up. His eyes were haunted, the gray iris clouded with the realization of what he had allowed to happen. She broke every regulation in the book, she assaulted a civilian contractor, she committed grand larceny, and she stole a government vehicle. But if she hadn't, I'd be writing 4 dozen letters to next of kin by Christmas. That is an emotional assessment, General, the DOJ liaison countered, leaning forward. The legal assessment is that Major Vance is a rogue element who has compromised a multi-billion-dollar international defense agreement. The Iron Horse Protocol is a national security matter. We cannot have an officer, no matter how well-intentioned, acting as a one-woman judge and jury. We need her in custody, and we need that laptop secured before she decides to upload the rest of that data to a public server. Thorne looked back at the screen. He saw the S stamp on the digital manifest, the signature of Thomas Vance. He knew the history. He knew the bloodline. He realized then that Elena hadn't just been hunting a ghost. She had been cleaning a house that the army had been too lazy to sweep. The reckoning was no longer a future possibility. It was a physical weight in the room, a cold draft that seemed to blow through the cracks in his own career. He didn't speak. He just stood up, his metals clinking softly against his chest, and walked out of the room, leaving the lawyers to figure out how to destroy the woman who had just saved their lives. Back at Fort Cavazos, the cost of loyalty was being measured in the dim, flickering light of an interrogation room in the Provost Marshal's office. Specialist Miller sat in a hard plastic chair, his hands cuffed to a bar on the table, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall 3 inches above the head of the man questioning him. He had been there for 14 hours. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. His uniform was rumpled, and there was a dark bruise on his jaw from where an MP had been a little too rough during the initial sweep of the signal shack. "Let's try it again, Miller," the CID investigator said. He was a man Elena had once trained, a sharp-featured captain named Stiles who seemed to be enjoying the reversal of fortunes. "You sent a flash message to the Port of Baltimore using a high-level override code. That code was assigned to Major Vance. You helped her bypass a direct order from the commander of the Criminal Investigation Division. That's Article 92, failure to obey a lawful order. It's Article 94, mutiny. If you don't give us her location, you're looking at 10 years in Leavenworth. Is that what you want? You want to throw away your career for a woman who didn't even care enough to take you with her?" Miller didn't blink. He felt a strange, quiet pride blooming in his chest, a sensation that was entirely at odds with the handcuffs and the cold room. He remembered the way the major had looked at him in the motor pool, not as a subordinate, but as a peer in the only thing that mattered, the truth. He remembered the specific weight of her hand on his shoulder when she told him he was the soldier she knew he was. For a kid from a trailer park in central Ohio, those words were more valuable than a pension. "The major didn't leave me behind, Captain," Miller said, his voice surprisingly steady. "She put me on the line, there's a difference." "She's a fugitive, Miller, she's a criminal." Stiles slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "She's unstable. We have medical records showing she's been under extreme stress. She's probably having a psychotic episode as we speak. If you help us find her, we can get her the help she needs. We can minimize your involvement. This is your one chance to stay on the right side of the line." Miller looked at Stiles, really looked at him, and saw the smallness of the man. He saw the fear of the careerist, the desperation of someone who wanted to please the generals more than he wanted to find the cracks in the steel. "The line moved, Captain," Miller said softly. "The major just stayed where she was. I think I'll stay there too." Stiles swore and stormed out, the heavy steel door clanging shut with a finality that should have terrified Miller. Instead, he just leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He thought about the ship in Baltimore. He thought about the pilots in Poland who would now wake up to a grounded fleet instead of a falling one. It was a small victory, quiet and classified, and he knew he would never get a medal for it. He would get a court-martial and a dishonorable discharge. He would lose his rank and his future. But as he sat in the dark, he realized he had never felt more like a man. In the cabin, Elena was operating on a level of dark competence that transcended the physical. She had managed to build a fire in the small pot-bellied stove using one hand and her teeth, the heat finally beginning to push back the damp chill of the Pennsylvania woods. She sat on the floor, the laptop open on her lap, the screen casting a pale, flickering light over her face. She was running a diagnostic on her own body, the same way she would run a diagnostic on a failing engine. Asterisk left radius, likely hairline fracture. Soft tissue damage, severe. Infection, stage 2, localized but spreading. Heart rate, 110. Cognitive function, 85%. Asterisk she needed to drain the wound. She knew the protocol. She found a paring knife in a kitchen drawer, its blade rusted but still sharp. She held it over the flames of the stove until the steel glowed a dull cherry red. She didn't hesitate. She didn't allow the fear to reach her hands. She bit down on a piece of leather from her belt and pressed the blade into the center of the swelling. The world went white for a second, a silent scream tearing through her mind, but she didn't move. She watched the dark, foul fluid drain away, her eyes clinical and detached. She was the person who found the crack. She was the person who fixed the foundation, even when the foundation was her own skin. When it was done, she wrapped the arm in a fresh strip of cloth, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She was smaller than she had been 2 days ago, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had been stripped of everything but necessity. She was a woman reduced to a single purpose. She looked at the laptop. The data was all there. Thomas Vance's empire was a digital map of corruption, a web that connected the foundry in Bethlehem to a series of high-level officials in the logistics agency and the Pentagon. It wasn't just about money. It was about a philosophy of acceptable loss. Her uncle had been right. The system wanted to be lied to. It was too big to see its own shadow, and it was easier to ignore a failing bolt than to admit that the entire machine was built on a lie. She felt the extraordinary capability flare again, that hyperacute awareness of how things broke. She didn't just see the data, she saw the trajectory of the response. They would try to discredit her first. Then they would try to capture her. If that failed, they would try to wait her out, letting the infection or the winter finish what the foundry hadn't. They were treating her like a structural defect in their own narrative. She reached for the burner phone. There were 3 missed calls from an unknown number. She knew it wasn't Miller. Miller was likely in a cell. It wasn't Sarah. Sarah wouldn't have the clearance to find this number. She waited, the phone heavy in her hand. It rang again at exactly 2200 hours. Elena, the voice said. It wasn't the raspy baritone of her uncle. It was a woman's voice, cool, professional, and entirely familiar. It was Colonel Sarah Jenkins, her old mentor from the academy, the woman who had taught her that the most important part of any structure was the part you couldn't see. Sarah, Elena whispered. Her voice sounded like dry leaves. Don't talk. Just listen, Sarah said. They've tracked the pings from the burner. They have a team from the 75th Ranger Regiment's RRD, Regimental Reconnaissance Company, moving into the valley. They're using thermal imaging and drone overflights. You have about 6 hours before they put a perimeter around that ridge. The official orders are apprehend with extreme prejudice. Do you understand what that means, Elena? It means they don't want me to talk to a judge, Elena said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the door. It means the Iron Horse protocol goes higher than we thought, Sarah said, and for the first time, there was a tremor of real fear in her voice. I saw the report Thorne tried to bury. They aren't just selling counterfeit steel, they're using the profits to fund a shadow procurement black bag operation that bypasses congressional oversight. It's a state within a state. You didn't just find a crack, Elena. You found the basement where they keep the bodies. Why are you calling me, Sarah? You're risking everything. Because I'm the one who told you that the truth matters, Sarah said. And because I don't want to live in a world where a woman like you is a footnote. There's a trailhead 2 miles north of your position. It leads to a logging road. There's a silver Tacoma parked near the bridge. The keys are under the wheel well. Get to the coast. Get to someone who can't be bought. They'll find you, Elena said. They already have, Sarah replied, and the line went dead. Elena stared at the phone for a long time. The personal cost was no longer just her career or her arm. It was the people she had left behind, the ones who were being ground up by the machine because they had dared to look at her and see the truth. She felt a surge of quiet, controlled rage, a cold, white fire that burned away the last of the fever. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was moving into the counteroffensive. She stood up, her body protesting every movement. She gathered her gear, the laptop, the Sig Sauer, the remaining ammunition. She looked around the small cabin one last time. It had been a sanctuary, but now it was a trap. She moved to the stove and tipped it over, the glowing coals spilling onto the dry floorboards. She watched for a moment as the wood began to smolder, the smoke rising in a thin, gray ribbon. She needed a diversion. She needed the thermal drones to see a heat signature that wasn't hers. She stepped out into the night. The air was freezing, a sharp, biting wind that tasted of snow. She didn't use a flashlight. She didn't need one. Her capability allowed her to see the world in terms of movement and resistance. She felt the slope of the land, the density of the trees, the way the wind moved through the hemlocks. She was a ghost in the machine, a shadow moving through a world of failing steel. As she climbed the ridge, she saw the first of the drones. It was a MQ-9 Reaper, a silent, predatory shape silhouetted against the stars. It was circling the cabin, its sensors locked onto the growing heat of the fire. Elena didn't look up. She kept her head down, her movements slow and deliberate. She was a master of the vertical approach, her boots finding purchase on the slick, frozen rock with a precision that was almost supernatural. She reached the trailhead just as the first of the tactical teams arrived at the cabin. She could see their infrared strobes blinking in the distance, tiny, rhythmic pulses of light that signaled the beginning of the end. She heard the muffled asterisk thud asterisk of a flashbang, then the rapid-fire asterisk pop 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 asterisk of suppressed weapons as they cleared a room that was already empty. She didn't feel triumph. She only felt a deep, weary sadness. These were her people. The Rangers, the MPs, the investigators, they were the ones she had sworn to protect. And now they were being used to hunt her down like a dog. The institution hadn't just failed her. It had turned itself inside out. She found the silver Tacoma near the bridge, just where Sarah had said it would be. She reached under the wheel well and found the keys, her fingers numb with the cold. She climbed into the cab, the smell of stale coffee and old upholstery, a strangely comforting scent. She didn't start the engine. She sat in the dark, watching the ridge. She thought about the man who had dismissed her, the authority figures who had laughed at her warnings. She thought about the way they had looked at her in the briefing rooms, the major with the eye for detail, the girl who was too focused on the small stuff. They had never seen her. They had only seen the role they had assigned to her, and now that she had stepped out of that role, they were terrified. Because a woman who knows the truth and has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous structure in the world. She started the truck, the engine turning over with a healthy, rhythmic thrum. She put it in gear and began to drive, her one good hand steady on the wheel. She wasn't heading for the coast. She was heading for Washington. If they wanted a reckoning, she would give them one. She would bring the house down, not from the outside, but from the foundation. As the truck moved down the logging road, the first flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the windshield in a layer of white. Elena watched them, her eyes cold and clear. She was a woman who had been broken and forged again in the heat of a foundry. She was the crack that was going to split the world. The drive was a blur of backroads and highway bypasses. She avoided the main arteries, moving like a shadow through the rural heart of Pennsylvania and Virginia. Every time she saw a state trooper, she felt the familiar spike of adrenaline, the control clamping down on her nerves like a vice. She was operating on a level of awareness that was exhausting, her mind constantly scanning the environment for threats, for surveillance, for the subtle shifts in the air that signaled a trap. She stopped at a truck stop outside of Winchester to clean her wound again. The bathroom was a fluorescent-lit nightmare of grime and bleach, but it was private. She stood in front of the mirror, looking at the woman she had become. Her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, her eyes sunken and rimmed with red. There was a jagged, angry scar on her cheek where the glass had cut her, a permanent reminder of the night the world changed. She looked older, harder. She looked like a person who had seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking. She realized then that she could never go back. Even if she won, even if the Iron Horse Protocol was exposed and the men responsible were brought to justice, there was no place for her in the army anymore. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had become the thing the institution feared most, a person who was loyal to the mission, but not the chain of command. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss for the woman she had been, the major who believed in the regulations, the woman who thought that if she just worked hard enough and was precise enough, she would be seen. That woman was dead, buried in the mud of the Lehigh River. The woman in the mirror was someone else entirely. She was a builder of a different kind. She returned to the truck and opened the laptop. She had one more thing to do before she reached D.C. She accessed the encrypted file that Sarah had mentioned, the one about the shadow procurement operation. She began to read, her heart slowing as the full scale of the betrayal became clear. It wasn't just about money or power. It was about a group of men who believed that they were the only ones capable of saving the country, and that the only way to do it was to burn the rules they had sworn to uphold. It was the ultimate structural failure. A system that destroys itself in an attempt to preserve its own existence. She began to type, her fingers moving across the keys with a ghost-like speed. She was drafting a final report, a document that would serve as both an indictment and a confession. She didn't use the language of a victim. She didn't beg for understanding. She wrote with the cold, clinical precision of an engineer describing a bridge collapse. She listed the dates, the names, the part numbers, and the specific failures. She attached the metallurgical scans, the shipping manifests, and the bank records. She titled the file "The True Cost of Steel." She was about to hit send to a list of media outlets and congressional oversight committees when a movement in the rearview mirror caught her eye. A black SUV had pulled into the lot, its headlights off, its dark windows reflecting the fluorescent light of the truck's stop. It didn't park in a space. It sat at the entrance, blocking the exit. Elena didn't panic. She didn't even breathe faster. She closed the laptop and tucked it into the passenger seat. She reached for the Sig Sauer, checking the chamber with a practiced, silent movement. She looked at the SUV, her mind already calculating the distance, the speed, and the structural integrity of the truck she was sitting in. They hadn't sent the police. They hadn't sent the FBI. They had sent a recovery team. The door of the SUV opened, and a man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but he moved with the unmistakable posture of a Tier 1 operator. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, but his jacket was unzipped, his right hand hovering near his hip. He walked toward the Tacoma with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes fixed on Elena through the windshield. Elena didn't wait for him to reach the window. She started the truck and slammed it into reverse, the tires screaming on the asphalt as she swung the back end around. The SUV driver lunged for his weapon, but Elena was faster. She shifted into drive and floored it, the Tacoma leaping forward with a roar of protest. She didn't head for the exit. She headed for the grassy embankment that led to the service road. The truck bounced over the curb, the suspension groaning as it hit the uneven ground. Elena gripped the wheel with her one good hand, the pain in her arm a distant, secondary concern. She saw the SUV in the mirror, its headlights finally coming on as it tore after her. The chase was short and brutal. Elena knew the Tacoma couldn't outrun the high-performance SUV on a straightaway, but she wasn't on a straightaway. She was in the mountains of Virginia, on roads that were narrow, winding, and treacherous. She used her capability to read the road, seeing the stress points in every curve, the places where the guardrails were weak, the spots where the ice had formed a slick, invisible trap. She pushed the truck to its absolute limit, the engine screaming at the red line. She felt the Tacoma beginning to fail, the steering becoming loose, the brakes beginning to fade. It was a vehicle that wasn't designed for this kind of stress, a machine that was being pushed past its fatigue life, just like her. She reached a sharp hairpin turn that overlooked a deep, wooded ravine. She could see the SUV closing in, its grille just inches from her bumper. She didn't slow down. She accelerated. At the last possible second, she slammed on the brakes and cut the wheel, the Tacoma skidding sideways in a cloud of burning rubber and blue smoke. The SUV driver didn't have time to react. He was moving too fast, his momentum carrying him forward. He tried to swerve, but the front wheels hit a patch of black ice Elena had seen 200 yards back. The SUV smashed through the guardrail with a sickening crunch of metal and glass, the heavy vehicle tumbling into the darkness of the ravine. Elena sat in the idling truck, her chest heaving, the silence of the woods returning with a deafening weight. She didn't look down at the wreckage. She didn't check for survivors. She knew that there were more of them coming. The machine was already recalibrating, sending the next team, the next drone, the next lie. She looked at the laptop. The report was still there, waiting. She realized then that sending it wasn't enough. If she sent it now, they would just call it the work of a disgruntled fugitive. They would bury it in a news cycle dominated by her mental break. To make the truth stick, she needed to deliver it in person. She needed to stand in the room where the decisions were made and force them to look at what they had done. She needed to go to the heart of the machine. She drove the Tacoma back onto the road, the truck limping now, a deep, rhythmic knocking coming from the engine. She knew it wouldn't last much longer. She would have to ditch it soon and find another way. But she didn't feel afraid. She felt a strange, cold clarity. She was no longer running. She was hunting. She thought about Miller, sitting in his cell. She thought about Sarah, whose career was likely over because of a single phone call. She thought about the pilots in Poland, their lives balanced on a knife edge of failing steel. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, jagged shard of glass she had kept. She looked at it, the light from the dashboard reflecting in its sharp edges. It was a small thing, a piece of a broken laptop, a fragment of a night that had cost her everything, but it was real. And as long as she was holding it, she was still Major Elena Vance. She pulled the truck into a dark, overgrown rest area 20 miles north of D.C. She knew she couldn't take the vehicle any further. The license plate was flagged, and the engine was on the verge of catastrophic failure. She climbed out of the cab, the cold air hitting her like a slap. She took the laptop and the cig, leaving the keys in the ignition. She began to walk toward the city, a shadow among shadows. She had no money, no ID, and no allies left. She was a woman with a broken arm and a broken name, moving toward the most powerful city on Earth. She looked up at the sky. The stars were bright and cold, indifferent to the struggles of the small, broken things below them. Elena felt a sudden, sharp memory of her father, the man who had taught her how to read the earth. He had always told her that the most important part of any structure wasn't the steel or the concrete. It was the intent, the reason it was built in the first place. "The army is a promise, Elena," he had said, his voice a warm memory in the cold night. "It's a promise we make to each other, that we'll have each other's backs, that we'll do the right thing even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." She touched the scar on her cheek. The promise was broken, the steel was failing, but the intent, her intent, was still there. It was the only thing that hadn't cracked. She reached the edge of the city as the sun began to rise, the white dome of the Capitol building glowing in the first light of dawn. It looked beautiful and solid, a monument to a system that was supposed to be unbreakable. Elena looked at it and saw the stress fractures. She saw the fatigue in the pillars, the rot in the basement, the cracks in the foundation. She wasn't there to fix it. She was there to show them where it was already broken. She walked into the city, her head up, her eyes clear. She knew that the next 24 hours would be the most difficult of her life. She knew that she might not survive them. But as she moved through the streets, a ghost in a world of waking people, she felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. The reckoning was here, and she was the one who was going to deliver it. She found a small, all-night diner near the outskirts of Alexandria. She walked in, the smell of grease and coffee hitting her with a wave of nausea. She sat in a back booth, her arm hidden beneath a borrowed jacket. She ordered a cup of black coffee, her hands steady as she lifted the mug to her lips. She watched the news on the television above the counter. There was a photo of her on the screen, the official army portrait, her hair in a tight bun, her uniform crisp and perfect. The headline read, "Fugitive Officer Sought in Security Breach." The anchor was talking about her history of mental instability and the theft of sensitive data. Elena watched it without flinching. She saw the way they were framing her, the way they were turning her into a villain. It was a good story. It was a clean story. It was exactly the kind of story the system wanted to tell, but it wasn't the truth. She finished her coffee and left a $5 bill on the table. She walked back out into the light, the city waking up around her. She had one destination, one room where the truth could finally land. She began to move toward the Pentagon, her pace steady and relentless. She knew the layout. She knew the security protocols. She knew how to get in, because she was one of them. She was a major in the United States Army, and she had a report to deliver. The building was a fortress of concrete and steel, a massive, five-sided monument to the power of the institution. Elena stood across the road, watching the flow of people moving in and out of the gates. She saw the guards, the cameras, the barriers. She saw the structural integrity of the place. She felt the extraordinary capability flare one last time, a surge of pure, cold awareness. She saw the crack. It wasn't in the walls or the gates. It was in the people. It was in the fear of the men who knew what she knew. It was in the silence of the people who were afraid to speak. She began to walk toward the main entrance, her hand on the laptop in her bag. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked directly toward the guards, her eyes fixed on the doors. "Major Elena Vance," she said when she reached the checkpoint. Her voice was clear, authoritative, and entirely calm. "I'm here to see General Thorne. Tell him I've brought the missing steel." The guards froze, their hands moving toward their weapons. The alarms began to sound, a shrill, rhythmic wail that echoed across the plaza. Elena didn't move. She stood in the center of the storm, a woman in a world of failing steel, waiting for the doors to open. She knew that the reckoning was finally beginning, and as she watched the security teams swarming toward her, she felt the cold, dark competence within her settle into its final, permanent shape. She was the one who found the crack. And now, she was the one who was going to let the light in. The heavy magnetic locks of the Pentagon's north entrance hummed with a sudden, violent urgency, a sound that Elena Vance felt in her teeth before she heard it with her ears. She stood perfectly still, her feet shoulder-width apart on the polished granite, her one good hand raised in a gesture of open-palmed surrender that looked more like a benediction. Around her, the morning commute of thousands of analysts, officers, and contractors ground to a terrifying halt. It was 0742 hours, and the air smelled of ozone, expensive floor wax, and the damp wool of rain-slicked overcoats. Two MPs in tactical vests, their boots squeaking with a rhythmic, frantic precision on the stone, closed the distance in 4 seconds. The muzzles of their M4 carbines were leveled at her chest, the laser sights dancing like tiny, angry red insects across the fabric of her borrowed jacket. Elena didn't blink. She watched the younger MP, a corporal with a fresh haircut and eyes wide, with the realization that he was aiming a weapon at a major whose face had been on the morning briefing slides for 48 hours. She saw the tremor in his hands, the way his weight was shifted too far onto his heels, a structural flaw in his stance that would make his first shot go high and to the right. "Major Elena Vance," she repeated, her voice a low, steady anchor in the sea of rising panic. "I am unarmed. The laptop in this bag contains the forensic evidence for the Iron Horse Protocol and the identities of the shell companies involved in the Sovereign Foundry procurement fraud. I will only surrender the encryption key to General Marcus Thorne." "On the ground, now," the older sergeant screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of a situation that didn't fit any of his training scenarios. Elena lowered herself with a slow, agonizing grace. Every inch of movement sent a jagged bolt of lightning from her fractured radius up into her shoulder, but she didn't let it reach her face. She knelt first, then lowered her chest to the cold stone, her cheek pressing against the floor. She watched a discarded security badge lying an inch from her nose, noting the micro fissures in the plastic. Everything was breaking. The institution, the steel, her own body, it was all falling apart, and she was the only one who could see where the pieces would land. The sergeant's knee came down hard into the small of her back, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp, silent huff, and the bite of the zip ties around her wrists was almost a relief. It was a physical constraint she could finally understand, a pressure that didn't require her to be anything other than a body in a room. They didn't take her to a cell. They took her to a windowless SIF in the basement, a room where the walls were lined with copper mesh to prevent signal leakage, and the silence was so absolute it felt like a physical weight against the eardrums. They left her there for 3 hours, cuffed to a heavy steel chair that was bolted to the floor. The room smelled of stale coffee and the metallic tang of the air filtration system. Elena sat with her spine perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the door. She spent the time mentally reconstructing the main rotor hub, of a UH-60 Black Hawk, tracing the molecular path of the 7% carbon deficit she had found in the Bethlehem scans. She saw the way the vibration of the engine would find the microscopic voids in the substandard steel, the way the heat would expand the fissures until the metal simply ceased to be a solid object. She saw the pilots falling through the sky, and she used that image to cauterize her own fear. The door opened with a heavy, pressurized thud. General Marcus Thorne walked in alone. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a weekend. His service cap was tucked under his arm, and his gray hair was uncharacteristically messy, as if he'd spent the morning running his hands through it in a dark room. He didn't sit down. He stood at the far end of the table, looking at the woman he had mentored, the woman he had dismissed, and the woman who had just burned his world to the ground. "You look like hell, Elena," he said. His voice was a rasp, the sound of a man who had run out of lies. "The steel failed, sir," she replied. She didn't ask for water. She didn't ask for a doctor. She didn't ask about her career. "The Polish delivery, the Vanguard 12 crates. If you let those birds fly, you're sentencing 48 men to death. That is the only fact that matters in this room." Thorne leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just find a procurement error. You hit a nerve that goes all the way to the Appropriations Committee. The Sovereign Foundry wasn't just a contractor, it was a laundry. They were overcharging for scrap-grade steel and using the delta to fund black-budget drone development in sub-Saharan Africa. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem. No congressional oversight, no public record, and you just put a spotlight on the whole hive. "I found a structural defect, General," Elena said, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying intensity. "In the military, when we find a defect, we fix it. We don't hide it in a shadow budget. We don't trade pilots' lives for black bag funding. That isn't the army I joined. That isn't the army you taught me to lead. The army you joined is a machine, Elena, and machines need grease." Thorne's voice rose, a sudden, violent burst of emotion that died as quickly as it started. He sat down heavily, the chair creaking under his weight. "They're going to crucify you. The DOJ liaison is already drafting the charges. Espionage, theft of government property, assault on a federal contractor. They're going to say you had a breakdown, that the stress of your father's death and the CID workload pushed you over the edge. They'll offer you a medical discharge if you sign a non-disclosure and hand over the laptop. If you don't, they'll send you to Leavenworth until you're old enough to forget your own name. I didn't bring the laptop for the DOJ, General. I brought it for you." Elena leaned as far forward as the cuffs would allow. "You're the only one who can sign the grounding order. You're the only one with the authority to stop the shipments before they leave the port of Baltimore. The lawyers can't stop the physics of failing steel. Only you can." Thorne looked at her, and for a moment, Elena saw the man he used to be. The colonel who had pulled a wounded private out of a burning Humvee in Fallujah. The officer who had told her that the most important part of a soldier's uniform was their integrity. Then the moment passed, and he was a general again, a man responsible for a multi-billion-dollar institution that was currently screaming for her head. "If I sign that order," Thorne whispered, "it's an admission that the entire logistics chain is compromised. It'll trigger a federal audit that will ground half the fleet for 2 years. Our readiness ratings will drop to 0. We'll lose the confidence of our allies. We'll be paralyzed." "We're already paralyzed, sir," Elena said softly. "We're just the only ones who know it yet. A fleet that can't fly safely isn't a fleet. It's a graveyard in waiting." The silence that followed was long and heavy, filled only with the hum of the SIF's air scrubbers. Thorne looked at the camera in the corner of the room, knowing that the men in the shadow office were watching, waiting to see if he would break. He looked back at Elena, at the blood on her sleeve, the bruise on her jaw, and the steady, unbreakable light in her eyes. He realized then that he had never really been her mentor. He had been her shadow, a man who had learned to live with the cracks while she was the one who had the courage to point them out. "The encryption key," Thorne said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Elena didn't hesitate. She gave him the code, a string of numbers that was the coordinates of her father's grave in Arlington. Thorne wrote it down on a piece of yellow legal pad, his hand steady. He stood up, tucked the paper into his pocket, and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. "General," Elena called out. He stopped, his hand on the heavy steel handle. "Tell Specialist Miller he did his job," she said. Thorne nodded once, a sharp, military gesture, and disappeared into the hallway. The next 48 hours were a blur of cold rooms, repetitive questions, and the agonizing throb of her arm. She was moved to a high-security wing of Fort Myer, where she was treated by a military doctor who didn't speak to her and guarded by MPs who looked everywhere but at her face. She was a ghost, a political radioactive element that everyone was trying to contain. They brought her a uniform, her own service greens, cleaned and pressed, and told her to get ready. "Where am I going?" she asked the MP sergeant who stood at the door. "The tank, ma'am," he said, his voice respectful but distant. "The board is waiting." The tank was the inner sanctum of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a room where the most consequential decisions in American history were made. As Elena walked in, the smell of old leather and history hit her like a physical force. Around the table sat 6 men and 2 women, the highest-ranking officers in the United States military. At the head of the table sat the Secretary of Defense, a man whose face was a mask of calculated neutrality. General Thorne was there, sitting off to the side, his eyes fixed on a file in front of him. The DOJ liaison, the man with the nasal drone she remembered from the reports, stood at a podium. He spent 20 minutes listing her crimes. He used words like unstable, unauthorized, and catastrophic breach of protocol. He showed photos of the damage she had done to the Sovereign Foundry, the stolen truck, the injured security guards. He painted a picture of a woman who had lost her mind and taken the Army's secrets with her. When he was done, the Secretary of Defense looked at Elena. "Major Vance, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Elena stood at the center of the room. She was wearing her medals, the silver and bronze symbols of a career spent being precise, being loyal, and being right. She looked at each of the generals in turn, her capability allowing her to see the tension in their shoulders, the way they were holding their breath, the structural weakness of their collective silence. "I have no defense for my actions," she said, her voice echoing in the hallowed room. "I broke the law. I violated my oath of office. I assaulted civilians and stole government property. I did those things because the system designed to prevent them had become the very thing that was killing our soldiers. I found a crack in the foundation of this institution, and when I reported it, the institution tried to bury the messenger instead of fixing the hole. I didn't act out of instability. I acted out of the most profound stability I know, the physics of the truth. If the steel is weak, the bird falls. If the leadership is corrupt, the army fails. I saw the failure and I moved to stop it. I would do it again tomorrow, regardless of the cost." She stopped talking. The silence in the tank was different than the silence in the SIF. It was a silence of reckoning. General Thorne stood up. He walked to the center of the room and placed a folder on the mahogany table. "Mr. Secretary, an hour ago, I signed the grounding order for the entire Vanguard 12 Fleet and all rotary wing aircraft using parts sourced from the Sovereign Foundry in the last 18 months. Forensic testing at Aberdeen has confirmed Major Vance's findings. The steel was compromised. The corruption within the logistics agency is systemic, involving 13 contractors and 4 high-level civilian officials. If Major Vance hadn't acted, we would have lost 48 pilots in Poland within the week. I am also submitting my resignation, effective immediately, for my failure to recognize the breach when it was first brought to my attention." The room exploded into a low, frantic murmur. The DOJ liaison looked like he'd been struck. The Secretary of Defense stared at Thorne, then at Elena, then at the folder on the table. The resolution didn't happen in a single, dramatic moment. It happened in the quiet, grinding gears of the bureaucracy over the next 6 months. There was no medal ceremony. There was no public vindication. The Iron Horse Protocol remained classified, a dark secret that the Army worked feverishly to scrub from the public record. The official story was that a comprehensive internal audit had discovered the procurement errors. The contractors were quietly indicted, the shell companies dissolved, and the shadow budget was reabsorbed into the general fund. Specialist Miller was released from custody. His Article 92 was dropped, and he was promoted to sergeant, though he was transferred to a remote listening post in Alaska where he could apply his unique skills without being a reminder of the embarrassment he had caused. Sarah Jenkins was forced into early retirement, her pension intact but her influence gone. She sent Elena a single postcard from a beach in South Carolina. It had no message on the back, just a picture of a lighthouse. Elena understood. The light was still there, even if the tower was gone. Elena Vance was given a choice. It was the kind of choice the military offers when they can't kill you and they can't keep you. They offered her a medical discharge with full benefits, citing service-connected psychological trauma and the permanent damage to her arm. In exchange, she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement that would send her to prison for 20 years if she ever spoke the words sovereign foundry or iron horse to anyone, including a therapist. She signed it. She didn't sign it for the money or the benefits. She signed it because the mission was over. The birds were grounded. The steel was being replaced. The crack had been filled, even if the scar remained. She walked out of the Pentagon for the last time on a cold, drizzly Tuesday in November. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She was wearing a civilian coat, her left arm in a permanent, subtle brace beneath the sleeve. She carried a single cardboard box containing the few personal items she had kept, a photo of her father, her West Point ring, and a small, jagged shard of glass that she never showed anyone. The transition to civilian life was a slow, quiet ache. She moved to a small town in the Shenandoah Valley, a place where the mountains felt like the ribs of the earth, solid and unchanging. She bought a small house with a workshop in the back, a place where she could work with her hands. She became an independent structural consultant, traveling to small towns across the Midwest to inspect bridges and old grain elevators. People liked her. They called her the woman with the eyes. They didn't know she had been a major. They didn't know she had saved a fleet. They just knew that when she looked at a rusted beam or a cracked foundation, she saw things they couldn't. She saw where the weight was falling. She saw where the break would start. And she told them the truth every single time. One evening, a year after she had left the army, Elena was sitting on her porch watching a thunderstorm roll in over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and wet cedar, a smell that always brought back the memory of the cabin in Pennsylvania. She was drinking a cup of coffee, her one good hand wrapped around the warm ceramic, when a black Chevrolet Tahoe pulled into her driveway. She didn't move. She didn't reach for a weapon. She just watched the truck, her mind automatically calculating the weight of the vehicle and the way the suspension settled on the gravel. A man stepped out. He was tall, silver-haired, and wearing a well-tailored suit that didn't quite hide the military bearing he would carry until the day he died. "Marcus," she said as he reached the porch. "Elena," he replied. He looked better. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled peace. He sat down in the chair next to her, looking out at the mountains. "It's a beautiful spot. Reminds me of the hills behind West Point. What are you doing here, Marcus? You're a long way from D.C. I was in the neighborhood, wanted to see how the arm was healing." He looked at her brace. "And I wanted to tell you about the 101st. Elena felt a sharp, familiar tightening in her chest. "What about them?" "They're deploying to Eastern Europe next month," Thorne said. "Brand new birds. Every single one of them has been through a triple redundant metallurgical scan. They're calling it the Vance Standard. Nobody uses that name in the official reports, of course, but the guys in the maintenance hangars, they know. They know why they're flying on good steel." Elena looked away, her eyes blurring for a second. She thought about the pilots. She thought about the fathers and mothers who would come home because of a choice she had made in a dark motor pool in the middle of the night. It was a victory that had no name, no medal, and no public record. It was a quiet, classified truth that lived in the vibration of an engine and the structural integrity of a rotor hub. It was the only thing she had ever really wanted. "Is it enough?" Thorne asked, his voice low. Elena thought about the cost. She thought about the career she had lost, the father she had buried, the friends who had been sidelined, and the person she used to be. The woman who believed the system was as strong as the people who served it. She looked at the mountains, seeing the way the ancient rock held up the sky, enduring the storms and the erosion and the weight of time. The mountains didn't care about medals or reports. they just stayed. "It has to be," she said. They sat in silence for a long time, two ghosts watching the rain. Thorne eventually stood up, offered her a small, respectful nod, and walked back to his truck. As he drove away, the first heavy drops of rain began to hit the tin roof of the porch, a rhythmic, metallic sound that felt like a heartbeat. Elena went inside and walked back to her workshop. On the table was a blueprint for a bridge in a small town in Ohio that had been built in 1948. She picked up a red pen and began to circle the stress points, her eyes moving over the lines with surgical precision. She saw the places where the steel was tired. She saw where the rivets were loosening. She saw exactly what needed to be done to make it hold. She thought about her father's workshop, the smell of grease and the sound of his voice. She thought about the promise they had made to each other. She realized then that she hadn't lost her identity when she took off the uniform. She had finally found it. She wasn't a major. She wasn't a fugitive. She wasn't a hero. She was a woman who knew how things were built and how they broke and why the difference mattered. She worked late into the night, the only light in the valley coming from her window. She felt a strange, quiet sense of belonging, a connection to the earth and the steel and the people she would never meet. She was a builder of foundations, a guardian of the things people took for granted. She was the one who saw the crack, and because she saw it, the world stayed whole for another day. As the storm passed and the moon came out, casting a silver light over the wet trees, Elena walked back to her porch. She took a deep breath of the cold, clean air, feeling the solid weight of the house beneath her feet. She looked up at the stars, the same stars that had watched her climb the ridge in Pennsylvania, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't see the fractures. She didn't see the fatigue. She just saw the light. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small shard of glass. She looked at it for a long moment, then walked to the edge of the porch and buried it in the dark, damp earth next to the steps. She didn't need it anymore. She didn't need the reminder of the night the world broke. She was living in the world she had helped to save, a world of good steel and honest intent. She went back inside, closed the door, and turned out the light. The house was solid, the foundation was deep, and for the first time in 15 years, Major Elena Vance slept through the night without dreaming of falling. The world was built on a promise, and she was the one who had kept it. The steel was holding,